The man was very surprised because gates leading to other worlds had appeared all over the earth out of nowhere. One of these gates was right in front of him. These dungeons were full of surprises because they contained terrifying monsters and untold treasures. People were eager to find new opportunities and dreams for themselves and were willing to do anything to achieve this. Overcoming their fears and exposing themselves to great danger, they began to descend into these dungeons. People had great difficulty making their way through these dungeons, and not everyone succeeded. However, there was one adventurous man who rushed through them at a stunning pace, something no one had ever done before. The monster sat in the dungeon on one of the hills and watched with interest as visitors came to see it. The guy looked up at the monster named Bahamut, and now understood that it was not surprising that the American elite had been unable to overcome it. Bahamut took a closer look at his visitor and was surprised to see that it was only one person. The monster roared and rejoiced that very soon he would be able to destroy the gate, and when that happened, he would finally be able to escape from this suffocating place. The monster wanted to turn the whole world into a great fire. The guy looked at the monster with a bored look and said that maybe it was time to stop these monologues and promised to quickly, let's say, extinguish the monster. Bahamut was not pleased with this comment and unleashed a large pillar of fire, believing that he had taught the guy a lesson. The monster initially thought that this man was simply out of his mind, as he did not even try to run away. But then the monster saw that the guy was standing behind a protective barrier, and the fire bypassed him. Bahamut appreciated the man's maneuver and thought that he might even be able to enjoy this battle, but promised that he would make sure that nothing remained of the guy. The monster wanted to attack, but nothing came of it, as the guy turned out to be not as simple as the monster thought. The guy used his magic and launched a powerful attack on the monster, causing a huge explosion that the monster couldn't avoid. After all this, Bahamut lay on the ground and refused to admit defeat. The monster growled menacingly so that the man would not even dare to look down on him. The guy suddenly saw magical spheres around him and realized that the monster was using them to restrict his movements. A moment later, Bahamut flew high into the air and was about to finally get even with this insolent man. He hovered above the ground and released a powerful jet of fire, hoping that this would definitely be more than enough. Bahamut was already mentally celebrating his victory, but suddenly something happened that he thought was simply impossible. The guy stood there and continued to stand, and there were no traces of fire on him. The man summoned his magic and focused completely on it, forming a kind of sphere. The monster couldn't understand where this overly arrogant and self-confident man had come from in the dungeon. The guy used his power and weapon to attack the monster again, and it was very effective. The monster did not immediately notice the large magical sphere flying towards it, and this did not bode well for it. The monster considered everything that had happened to be absurd since he was a god, but nevertheless he began to understand that he had lost to some human. The guy was completely enveloped in white light and was pleased with his well-done work. A large hole filled with magical power formed in the ground where all this had happened. The man who had been called an inept adventurer in his time rose to the top of this world. He was not experienced or skilled at the time, but he still succeeded, and his name was Seki Iori. The guy achieved success in this dungeon and decided for himself that now it was time to visit the next one. This was the story of how he regained his extraordinary power. 20 years ago, gates leading to other worlds appeared and began to be called dungeons. At the same time, some people awakened special powers, which were later called skills. Only 1% of the population possessed these skills, and after some time, an organization called the Adventurers Guild was created. Very tall buildings rose up in the city, and all this was happening in Tokyo. A guy in one of these buildings approached the reception desk and placed his palm on the magic sphere. He definitely had to possess skills if he wanted to challenge the harsh dungeons. An information window popped up with all the details about this guy, and it showed he didn't have any skills. There had never been a single person who dared to become an adventurer without any skills. The girl at the registration desk decided to ask Saiki Iori if he was sure he wanted to become an adventurer, considering that he had no skills whatsoever. The guy replied that everything was fine and he was absolutely sure of his desire, so he asked the girl once again to just register him. He thought to himself that he must really be out of his mind. He was about to leave when he suddenly heard a similar question being asked nearby, where the girl was also asked if she wanted to become an adventurer without any skills. The unfamiliar girl confidently replied that she did and added that she couldn't wait to start working together. Saeki Iori couldn't even imagine that there would be someone here as crazy as he was. A man suddenly appeared between them and emotionally shouted that two clumsy people who had no skills were going to become adventurers. He thought it was truly insane because they were headed straight for the afterlife. The man asked to be allowed to personally demonstrate to the newcomers how everything worked here. The girl replied that she didn't mind and that in that case she would leave the two men in the care of a man named Fukumoto-san. The guy knew that adventurers were divided into ranks from F to C, and this was the so-called middle rank, or perhaps the C rank included many veterans. Fukumoto-san was happy to fill these guys in on the situation because he was C rank after all. After a while, the guys were walking down the street and the girl decided to ask Saiki Iori why he decided to become an adventurer, since he didn't have any skills either. She understood that asking such a question was slightly inappropriate. The guy decided to answer without going into any details and simply said that it was no secret that adventurers earned very well. And even though he had no skills, he also wanted to fulfill his dream. He knew very well that when monsters were defeated in the dungeon, they dropped magic stones and various items. Magic stones were very valuable because even the lowest ranked F stone could cost about 10,000 yen per piece. Saiki had his own reason why he simply had to earn a lot of money no matter what. The guy remembered that he often returned home with a large bag of necessary items and food, and they were already waiting for him there. Saiki did not live alone in the apartment, but with his sister, who was only 15 years old. Their parents had disappeared, and now the guy had to pay for his younger sister's education himself. He didn't think their life was rich, but he was very happy. One day, the guy came home to an unpleasant surprise. Saiki entered the apartment and saw his younger sister, Kotoha, lying unconscious on the floor. The young man became very worried because he did not know what had happened to her. He immediately called an ambulance, and after a while, the doctor informed him that his sister had developed a skill that was consuming her own body. The doctor also said that this disease is known as incompatible skill syndrome. The guy also heard that it was a pretty rare disease and that this was the first case of its kind in Japan. The only cure for this disease is a new drug made in the US. Saiki thought that this couldn't be true because he knew very well that medical care there was insanely expensive. The doctor informed the young man that his younger sister's treatment would cost approximately 500 million yen. When Saiki heard these figures, he couldn't recover for a long time because it was an unbearable amount for him. The girl brought the guy back from his memories and said that she completely agreed that adventurers were people who followed their dreams. She also asked if Saiki really wanted something like that. Saiki laughed at these words, but still replied to the girl that yes, he really did want that. After a while, the guys approached a tent that was located in the park. The guys didn't spend much time looking at the tent and immediately decided to go inside, where they could see a kind of magical sphere. Fukumoto-san was already there with several other people and was eagerly telling them something. One of the men, after seeing the guys, decided to ask Fukumoto if these were the newbies he had recently written about in their chat. Another man still couldn't believe that these guys were really incompetent and had no skills. Many people often looked down on those who had failed to develop any skills and called them incompetent. Everyone understood how important it was to have these skills, but these two guys were clearly the exception. One of the men extended his hand to greet them and said that he was pleased to meet the incompetent ones. They believed that the young men could learn a lot by observing their elders at work and watching their movements. The girl was full of energy and enthusiasm, so she smiled and said she was happy to meet them. Saiki also bowed his head low and said that he was also very pleased to meet them all. The men decided that in this case, they should go straight to the dungeon and explain all the details to the young people on the way. The girl suddenly became very frightened and asked the men to wait, her voice trembling. Saiki thought to himself that he would certainly like them to explain everything to them in advance. The guy realized that waiting for this was pointless, so he followed the men, indignant that they had called him incompetent. In that case, he decided to look at the information window, which said that his skill was a forbidden restriction. The guy remembered that his status in the guild said that he had absolutely no skills, and he understood why, because it was all due to the fact that it was a hidden skill. The principle of the forbidden restriction was extremely simple, as it allowed the user to use magic from their past life in exchange for skill points. Using magic obtained in this way did not consume OM. He wanted to raise his level and gain skill points. The guy wanted to use them to get the magic he had used in his past life. Saiki could still describe all this in other words and conclude that he was some kind of reincarnator. Memories came flooding back one after another of the guy fighting monsters and defeating them. It wasn't always easy or simple, but he always achieved his goal. In his past life, he had become quite skilled in magic and earned the title of Archmage Loner. The guy looked at himself only in his past life and was overwhelmed by memories. Despite all this, even after mastering magic, the guy did not feel the joy that he had already experienced in this life. Saiki remembered his younger sister Kotohi and realized that everything he had achieved in his past life was nothing compared to her. The guy remembered the cost of his sister's treatment and those 500 million yen. Normally, it would be impossible to earn that much money in a lifetime, even if he worked tirelessly. That's why Saiki decided to become an adventurer, so he could earn that amount of money as quickly as possible. However, even for an S-rank adventurer, it wouldn't be easy to save 500 million yen in such a short period of time. Only with a forbidden restriction does it become somewhat realistic and possible for the young man. He was sure that he would definitely earn the money that his younger sister so desperately needed. Saiki only dreamed and wanted one thing, for his sister Kotoha to wait for him and not give up prematurely. At that moment, Fukumoto-san looked very serious and skillfully wielded his weapon, demonstrating his abilities. Another man was also doing well and showing only his strongest qualities, so that the new guys would have something to look at. The third man was not far behind his comrades and was confident in his abilities, believing that they now had an easy task ahead of them. But since it was still an E-rank dungeon, that was to be expected. Fukumoto told the guys to watch them very carefully and see what it means to be a C-rank adventurer. The girl stood next to Saiki and watched everything very carefully because she was interested in learning and understanding everything. She suddenly asked the guy what was wrong with him because Saiki looked kind of down. The guy replied that she had nothing to worry about, and that what was more important was that Amami-san seemed to really like it here. Saiki looked at the men in front of him and was convinced that they were not going to teach them anything. The guy thought that this was better than any threats, and Amami-san replied that it was all because he had always dreamed of becoming an adventurer. Amami couldn't contain her emotions and said that she was simply thrilled by the fact that she had the opportunity to see all this up close. The guy smiled at the girl's words and advised Amami that in this case, she should watch everything closely and do so very carefully so that she could learn something. The girl thought about it and then realized that the guy was absolutely right, and she would definitely take his advice. One of the men was very focused on his battle at that moment, as it was not as easy as last time. He suddenly shouted to the two new guys to run away immediately and do it as quickly as possible because something was moving towards them at high speed. Amami saw it herself and was very frightened, and because of her fear, she couldn't even move. She closed her eyes in fear, but when she realized that nothing had happened to her, she decided to open one eye and assess the situation around her. The girl saw that a large column had fallen on the creature, destroying it. Fukumoto was afraid for the children and hoped that they were all right and that none of them had been hurt. The girl replied that, judging by all appearances, they were very lucky, and that the column had collapsed just in time, which was a great relief to her. Saiki-san did not comment on the situation and was not going to say anything, so he simply said that yes, they were very lucky. Fukumoto was glad to hear that the guys were unharmed, and said that since that was the case, the next on their list was the dungeon boss. Saiki was completely ready and very determined, and the girl held on to the guy's back because she subconsciously felt safe that way. Suddenly, a voice told them all that the first condition of arriving in the boss's room without taking any damage had been fulfilled. The men were very surprised because none of them knew who the voice belonged to or what it meant. A few minutes passed, and the same voice said that the second condition, to bring 2 newcomers, had also been fulfilled. Fukumoto suddenly thought that they had a chance to get some kind of treasure, and he was very happy about that. The voice continued, saying that the third condition, to bring someone who had not yet awakened their skill, had been fulfilled. The voice also said that since all 3 conditions had been fulfilled, it was summoning an additional boss. A moment later, a very large monster appeared before them, which was also armed. The men did not waste any time and began to run away, while Saiki and the girl froze in surprise, as they did not expect such a reaction from these people. Saiki thought for a moment and suddenly realized that this meant their retreat was cut off. Amami really hoped that these men would be able to defeat this monster because otherwise they would be in big trouble. Saiki paused for a moment and then said that they had no choice but to trust their comrades. One of these people, whose name was Yamada, was unable to dodge or avoid the monster at that moment, and as a result, the monster was able to attack him with its weapon. Saiki said nothing more but simply watched silently as everything unfolded, and the picture was not comforting, and things were going very badly. He understood that if the guys made such sweeping attacks when the difference in strength was clear as day, they would be easily counterattacked. Saiki wasn't entirely sure that his decision was the right one or whether his plan would work, but he knew for sure that he had to at least try, so he ran to help the others. Fukumoto was upset that they couldn't defeat the monster and mentally apologized to Yamada for not being able to avenge him properly. Saiki appeared so unexpectedly that Fukumoto was very surprised, as he hadn't even thought about it. Without wasting another minute, the boy used his sword to attack the monster. Saiki and the monster locked horns in battle, and neither was going to give in, as each hoped that he would be the one to win. While fighting the monster, the guy suddenly turned to Fukumoto-san and shouted that he had a plan to defeat the beast. Saiki warned him right away that the man had to do as he said and not ask any questions for now. The guy never forgot, and now even more so, since he had an all-powerful hidden skill, a forbidden restriction. He also knew that there was a specific reason for this restriction. In exchange for the ability to use magic without all the spells from his past life were sealed away. The magical chain in the guy's body remained untouched, but even after many attempts, he was still unable to use any spell. The boy hoped that perhaps when he removed the restriction imposed on him, he would finally be able to surpass his previous self. For this reason, Saiki came up with a plan on how to defeat this monster without getting hurt themselves. The guy needed help to do this, which is why he asked Fukumoto-san to do as he said. Fukumoto watched the guy and how he fought, so he asked him if Saiki was really incompetent, because all his movements suggested the opposite. The man even got angry because he began to think that the guy had lied to him, and that he did have skills after all. Saiki replied that it would be better to talk about all this a little later, because right now their main goal was to destroy this monster. The guy asked Fukumoto if they could buy him some time and added that he only needed a little. The man didn't ask any more questions and simply replied that he would do everything he could. Saiki was grateful for this and that they no longer asked him any questions about his skills, because they were not really relevant at the moment. At that moment, the monster decided not to wait for them and, raising his weapon high, decided to attack the people he saw in front of him. While the guys were still thinking about what to do in such a situation, a large fireball suddenly flew at the monster, which was a big surprise. Fukumoto thanked his friend Hasegawa because it was his job, and Hasegawa himself was very angry at that moment because the monster dared to harm his friend Yamada. The boys suddenly started to run away because the monster quickly regained consciousness, and Fukumoto decided to ask the boy how much time he needed. Saiki replied that he needed 5 minutes, but immediately changed his mind and asked for at least 3 minutes, if that was possible. The guy remembered that in his past life he had already fought minotaurs. When Fukumoto heard the guy's answer, he thought that he would definitely die while buying time for Saiki. Saiki knew that they were too strong and that the other monsters in this dungeon were no match for them. He also understood that if they fought them using normal tactics, it would surely be the end for them. At that moment, the girl was hiding behind a large rock and was very worried about the guys, but she was most concerned about Saiki-san's safety. As soon as she had the chance, she asked the guy if he was okay and decided to find out if Saiki had really blocked that thing's attack. The guy replied that he was fine, but he only had one way to defeat it. Saiki turned to Amami-san and said that there was something more important and asked the girl to help him. Amami-san did not expect such a request from the guy because she had no idea how she could be of any use. The girl almost immediately replied that she couldn't because she wouldn't be able to hurt the monster or even get close to it. The guy looked the girl in the eyes and said that this was exactly what she had always dreamed of. Saiki reminded the girl that she had always wanted to be an adventurer, and now was the perfect moment for it. The girl was very scared and not at all confident, which is why she couldn't fulfill this request. Saiki then told Amami-san that in order to defeat the Minotaur, he would need her help and that he definitely couldn't do it without her. Amami was still unsure, but she couldn't refuse the guy, so she was ready to do whatever he told her to do. The girl decided to ask the guy what exactly she would have to do to defeat this monster. Saiki replied that he had no time to explain and told the girl to just sit still and not move. The girl obediently complied with his request, and at that moment, the guy stood behind her, preparing to do something. Saiki asked the girl in advance not to be angry with him for what he was about to do. The girl sensed that something was about to happen, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. Amami couldn't stand it after she felt the guy put his hand on the back of her neck, so she decided to ask Saiki what he was doing. The guy understood perfectly well that from the outside and for the girl herself, it all looked very strange and inappropriate, but it was his secret plan. Saiki was well aware that these minotaurs were weak against magical attacks, and he was going to use this weakness to his advantage. The guy also knew that Hasegawa-san's magic would not be able to inflict a wound on the monster that would ultimately send it to the other world. Hasegawa simply had too low a skill level and lacked the necessary power. They looked at the monster and realized that it hadn't even flinched after they attacked it. So in order to defeat this beast, they needed to cast a powerful spell on it. At that moment, Saiki was standing apart, carrying out his actions related to the girl. Due to a forbidden restriction, the guy couldn't use any of his spells at the moment, which is why he decided to use Amami-san's magic, since it was all quite simple. Saiki simply wanted to gain control of Amami's magic chain, and then he would add the necessary movements so that the girl could use magic. From the outside, of course, it might have looked a little different. The girl was completely relaxed and trusted the guy, doing everything he told her to do. A little more time passed, and the girl realized that this was going a little too far, so she asked Saiki to stop immediately. The girl instantly forgot about this slightly unpleasant incident, as something strange and previously unknown to her began to happen to her. The guy asked the girl if she could feel some kind of power flowing inside her body. Amami replied that this was indeed the case, and now she wanted to understand what Saiki-san had done to her. The guy replied that, to put it simply, he had just taken the necessary measures so that she could use magic. The girl did not expect to hear anything like that because she had absolutely no skills. Saiki replied that she shouldn't worry about anything and added that she had a talent for magic. Saiki added that he himself couldn't use magic for certain reasons. The guy looked at the girl and said that this was exactly why he relied on her so much and hoped that they would succeed and defeat the monster. At that moment, the other guys were in a tough spot because the monster was much stronger than them and kept attacking them over and over. Fukumoto was unable to dodge or somehow escape the last attack and was thrown back by the shockwave. Hasegawa wanted to avenge his comrade and was very determined to do so. The monster was quicker and stronger, and the shockwave threw the man back as well. Fukumoto was already struggling to stand, so he shouted for the newcomer to hurry up. Otherwise, the monster would simply destroy them all at this rate. Saiki understood this himself and was ready, hoping that the girl would not let him down, as he had placed a lot of hope in her. The guy asked Amami to try to calm down and told her to just repeat after him and everything would work out. He said that this language was unfamiliar to the girl, so it would be a little difficult for her, but he would try his best to keep it short. Saiki looked at the girl and told her to focus and not get distracted by anything, but to be very concentrated. Amami-san did everything her companion told her to do, as it was their only hope for salvation. The guy was pleasantly surprised because the girl had no combat experience but remained so focused even in such a difficult situation, and that was really encouraging. After a while, Saiki told the girl to point her hands toward the Minotaur. Amami-san did everything exactly as she was told without any questions, because she totally trusted the guy. A moment later, the girl heard that she needed to use the Crimson Lotus Fireball. Without wasting any time, she immediately did as she was told and was completely focused on it. A large ball of fire, magic, and energy burst from the girl's hands and flew straight at the monster. After the powerful magical attack was unleashed on it, the monster immediately burst into flames and was unable to escape, thus being destroyed. Amami looked at the results of their joint effort and was amazed by Saiki-san's power. The guy said that he would not have been able to achieve anything like this, and Saiki believed that Amami-san deserved much of the credit. The girl was embarrassed by such praise and sincerely thanked the guy for his words. The guys ended up getting the Minotaur's axe, and a little further ahead they saw something brightly shining. A large magic stone shone above a small pedestal, and as a result of their victory over the monster, the guy was able to level up and received the title of Archmage Reincarnation. After defeating the Minotaur, they left the dungeon and called an ambulance for the injured guys. Fortunately, the three were in stable condition, but they were still seriously injured. The guy understood perfectly well that he had no excuse for what he had put Fukumoto-san and his companions through. Deep within the dungeon was its core, which possessed incredible power. If this core was destroyed, the dungeon would collapse, and usually the core was destroyed after the dungeon was captured. But in some cases, for example, to create a training ground for adventurers, it was left untouched. This core reminded the guy of the technology from his past world, but Saiki decided that he had nothing to worry about after all. After everything that had happened to them, the guys returned to the Adventurers Guild. They handed their guild cards to their superiors and now waited for the records to be analyzed. These cards recorded every monster that a person had defeated, and the supposed reason for this whole procedure was to ensure the fair distribution of rewards. The guys sat waiting until a man approached them and thanked them for waiting. The man introduced himself as Hamada and said he was an employee of the General Affairs Department of the Adventurers Guild. He returned their guild cards to them. Hamada said he would like to ask the guys a few questions about the additional boss that had appeared. The guys introduced themselves one by one and greeted the man, after which Hamada suggested they get straight to the questions he was interested in. At that moment, Saiki began to worry a little because he wasn't sure that Amami would keep her promise. The guy thought that maybe he had gone too far, but a little earlier he had approached Amami and asked her to hide the fact that he had helped her use magic. Amamiya-san didn't understand why the guy didn't want to tell anyone about it, since he had defeated the Minotaur himself and thus saved all the kids. Saiki said that it could all become a big problem, especially when people started asking him about what had happened. He also said that he really needed to start earning money as soon as possible. Amami replied that it sounded like something very bad had happened to him. Without thinking twice and without asking any more questions, the girl said she understood everything and promised not to tell anyone. Saiki was very grateful to her for that. The girl suddenly turned to the guy and immediately apologized for asking him something after what he had told her. Amami asked the guy to take her as his student and added that she really wanted it. Saiki sadly lowered his head and replied that he couldn't do that. At first, the girl looked very confused because she had hoped for a different answer. Amami said that this answer was not so unexpected for her because she had guessed it. The guy replied that he was refusing not because it was too troublesome or anything like that. He was doing so because of the girl's reaction at that very moment. The guy thinks that the girl is not cut out to be an adventurer. He didn't want to teach Amami magic irresponsibly and didn't want the girl to die. The girl realized that she was probably not suited for this, and she was very sorry because the guy was most likely right. Amami decided that now she would have to think carefully about what she would do next. Saiki returned from his memories and heard Hamada ask how it was that after Fukumoto's group, the monster was already on the verge of destruction, and Amami simply delivered the final blow to the weakened Minotaur. Hamada decided that he had understood everything correctly because, after all, the guys had no skills. The man asked the girl what she had been doing while Fukumoto's group was fighting the Minotaur. Amami replied that she had simply watched their battle at that moment, and when the Minotaur was on the verge of defeat, she and Saiki delivered the final blow. Saiki interrupted their conversation and added that, at that moment, they thought it was the only thing they could do. Hamada said that, judging by their words, it seemed that they had delivered the final blow together, which was why the final blow had been credited to Amami-san. The man was convinced that the two of them had indeed managed to defeat the Minotaur without any special skills. Hamada sincerely thanked the boys for their cooperation. Hamada took 2 envelopes out of his pocket and handed them to the boys, saying that this was their reward for defeating the Minotaur. The guys thanked Hamada for this and began to open their envelopes. Saiki was very curious about how much was in there, and the guy guessed that it might be around 20,000 yen. After seeing the amount, Saiki looked very surprised because there was much more than he had expected, and he had not counted on 250,000. Amami also could not believe that all this money was hers alone. Amami saw that she now owned 3 million yen, which was exactly how much defeating the Minotaur was worth. Hamada also said that the rules of the Adventurers Guild stated that 70% of the total reward belonged to the person who delivered the final blow. Hamada explained that the other groups would divide the remaining 25% among themselves. He told them that this was quite fair, and was done so that the entire reward would not go to the person who delivered the final blow. He said that if they were in a clan, the reward would be divided equally, so he advised the guys to consider joining a clan. Hamada did not hesitate to tell the guys that they had high hopes for them. The guys laughed, and Saiki promised the man that they would do their best, despite their incompetence. Late in the evening, Saiki was walking home, and realized that he had earned 250,000 yen on his first day of work for the Adventurers Guild. He had earned a month's salary in 1 day. Saiki remembered how Amami decided that the guy should take her money because she couldn't accept 3 million yen since she hadn't done anything. The guy replied that without her help, he wouldn't have been able to do anything either, so he told her to keep the money, and besides, if the guild found out that he had taken the check for himself, there would definitely be an uproar. Amami still couldn't agree with these arguments because she still felt she didn't deserve the money. Saiki suddenly said that if neither of them needed the check, the girl could just burn it. Amami was shocked by this suggestion because she couldn't understand how anyone could burn such a large amount of money. The guy couldn't hold back a smile, and after a few moments, he looked at the girl and said with a serious expression that in that case, Amami should just keep it for herself, and that would be that. After everything that had happened to them, the two exchanged contact information and went their separate ways. The guy sat in his room and thought about how he hadn't fought like that in a long time, but apparently his skills hadn't dulled. He looked again at the check he had been given and made sure that he had indeed received 250,000 yen for defeating some Minotaur. Saiki realized that adventurers really did earn a lot of money. The guy's attention was suddenly distracted by his phone ringing unexpectedly, displaying the name of his younger sister, Kotoha. Kotoha told her brother that she was feeling better today and had eaten 3 whole puddings, which made her very happy. Saiki knew that in her condition, eating 3 whole cups of pudding was quite a feat for his sister. The guy asked only one thing, for Kotoha to wait a little longer because he was sure that very soon he would be able to earn 500 million yen, and for that he needed to learn how to use the forbidden restriction as quickly as possible. Saiki suddenly remembered that after this battle he had raised his level and seemed to have earned skill points, and he decided to double-check all this in the operation window. A few minutes later he was able to read that he had reached level 10 and now had the ability to summon a fairy. A few moments later there was some kind of strange explosion, and the guy didn't understand what caused it. He saw a creature in front of him that looked like a little girl with multicolored hair, clutching a strange key in her hands. The guy looked closer and realized that it was indeed a fairy standing in front of him. This very fairy suddenly opened one of her eyes to assess the situation and understand who was in front of her. The fairy pounced on the guy and started hitting him with her little hands, complaining that Saiki was so slow. She was angry because the guy had missed training for a whole 20 years. Saiki couldn't understand why this fairy was so angry with him, and tried to calm her down a little by saying that before she scolded him like that, she should tell him who she was. The fairy calmed down a little and decided why not, and began to say that she was created by him in a past life, and that she was a fairy who controlled forbidden restrictions. She looked at the guy very intently and said that she had only one goal she wanted to achieve. The guy asked what that goal was, and the fairy replied that more than anything, she wanted to make him stronger than Iori. The fairy told him that she had been with him in his past life, and that she was a fairy who controlled forbidden restrictions. Now she had only one goal, and that was to make him stronger, and she would definitely achieve it. That is why the fairy was very disappointed that he had been idle for 20 years. She began to scold him severely and get angry that he was so careless about all this. The guy tried to understand what was going on because he had no memory of creating the fairy in his past life. The fairy concluded from the guy's words that he was apparently missing part of his memories. The guy didn't understand and thought it was impossible because he remembered everything else. Saiki suddenly thought for a few minutes and looked very focused, then said that he had remembered something after all. The fairy was completely focused on finding out what the guy had managed to remember from his past life. Saiki began to say that he did not remember the moment when he passed away, but he remembered that he had been affected by an incurable disease and was getting weaker every day. The fairy decided to tell the guy only that she was born after Saiki passed away. The guy concluded that it was very likely that his reincarnation was not accidental, and he assumed that he had probably been plotting something in his past life. The fairy replied that it was pointless to dwell on all this, and that it was not worth wasting such precious time on it. Saiki realized that the fairy probably couldn't tell him about it, and that perhaps he himself had limited what she could tell him in his past life. The boy agreed with the fairy that it was pointless to dwell on all this under the circumstances. Saiki decided to ask the fairy what she meant when she said she wanted to make him stronger. The fairy replied that by renewing the forbidden restriction, he would be able to become stronger even faster. The guy decided to clarify whether this was different from acquiring skills through the exchange of points. The fairy replied without hesitation that acquiring skills was not even close to it, and she did not even want to compare the two. She decided to use her power to demonstrate something to the guy. Saiki saw in the system window that a new system called item exchange had been added. The fairy explained that thanks to this, he would be able to obtain any item he had ever owned in his past life. She also said that, of course, the number of items was limited to their original supply. The guy decided to clarify that he would be able to obtain even the items that were in the storage box. By storage box, the guy meant the subspace storage he had created in his past life as an archmage. The fairy replied that he could get items from there as well because at that time the guy was an avid collector and had many rare items that he could get back if he wanted to. The guy couldn't quite believe it and thought it was all just unbelievable. The fairy decided to explain something else because returning those items was not so simple, and there were certain conditions for the exchange. The guy guessed that every good story had its downsides, and he was almost certain that this was also the work of his past self. The fairy warned the guy that if he complained, she would not allow him to use the system at all. Saiki apologized and said that he would definitely find a worthy use for all of this. He opened the system window to check how it all worked. The guy saw a mithril sword and a durandal sword, as well as many other things, and these were indeed his belongings from his past life. Saiki suddenly thought that there should be one more thing here, and he managed to find the almighty elixir that cost 500 million yen and could instantly cure all diseases and injuries. And there were 5 of them in stock. The guy once again thought about how much he needed those 500 million yen. He decided that he would definitely earn the entire amount he needed and thus help his younger sister. The fairy saw the guy's determination, and she couldn't help but be happy because he seemed to have very strong motivation. She decided to tell him one last piece of news that he also needed to know. The fairy began to tell him that during his battle with the Minotaur, she thought that he could easily become stronger by overcoming all the difficulties in his path. She said that this was why she had cast a buff on the young man, and thanks to it, when he defeated an enemy superior to him in strength, he would be able to gain twice as much experience. Saiki asked how it all worked, as he didn't understand it at all. The guy thought to himself that if the fairy was telling the truth, then his path would be much easier. He was planning to fight stronger opponents anyway in order to earn more money for it. Saiki confidently said that he would definitely use the forbidden restriction to its full power. The fairy was pleased to hear his answer and praised the guy for his excellent and correct attitude. Saiki suddenly remembered that he still didn't know the fairy's name, so he decided to ask her about it. The fairy replied that she had no idea and that he had created her, so he could come up with something. The guy immediately warned her that if that was the case, then she shouldn't complain or say anything later if she suddenly didn't like something. Without thinking twice, Saiki said that her name would be Sphere and began to watch her reaction. The fairy repeated the name again and said that it sounded pretty good, and added that he could now call her that. The guy couldn't help but smile and was glad that the fairy seemed to like her new name. The fairy suddenly said that nothing of the sort and added that they needed to make him stronger. She also decided to warn him right away that if the guy started being lazy again, she would get very angry. She also said that in addition to everything else, he had to prepare her bath every day and desserts twice a day, and emphasized that there should always be ice cream in the refrigerator. Saiki was surprised because all of this required a lot of money, which he already needed very much. The fairy decided to remind him that she controlled the forbidden restriction, and if he didn't agree, she could easily forbid him from using it. The guy guessed that this was probably some kind of payment for using the forbidden restriction. The fairy was glad that the guy understood her correctly and said that he would start doing this tomorrow. After he was left alone, the guy thought about how this fairy had fallen on him like a bolt from the blue. But if he could gain double experience by fighting stronger enemies, it would be just great. Saiki realized that, to be honest, he was quite weak at the moment because he only had E-rank abilities, or more precisely, F-rank abilities. He thought that this was even better, and that he would be able to change this by becoming an archmage. The guy decided to enter a query in the system window and find out all the news about recruiting for dungeon raids. He was sure that he would be able to achieve a much higher rank than his current one. Saiki was well aware that all this would, of course, be within reasonable limits, and that he must not forget this. The next day, with the help of the Adventurers Guild, he joined a D-rank dungeon raid, but since his personal rank was F, he was only there as a background character. A guy approached Saiki and greeted him, saying that his name was Takai, and that he was a C-rank adventurer with a skill in longsword mastery. Saiki also greeted a girl named Suzukaze, who was skilled in the use of a variable bow and arrows. In addition to these guys, there were 2 other guys who also greeted Saiki and looked him over carefully. Takai said that they were just one person short of a full group, so Saiki had practically saved them. One of the guys couldn't keep quiet and said that, besides, F-ranks didn't get a share of the spoils. Takai asked the guy to stop talking like that because he thought it was too rude, but the guy thought that Saiki would be even better without any special treatment and that he didn't have any skills anyway. Saiki confirmed this, but said he could compensate for his lack of skills. One of the guys whispered to Saiki that he didn't even need to worry because there were 3 C-rank adventurers in their group, and that's why they needed someone like him as backup. However, it turned out that this guy, whose name was Ozawa-san, was not simple at all and had a D rank. Saiki looked closely at the girl and figured out that she had an S rank and was about the same age as his younger sister, Kotoha. A few minutes later, they all approached the entrance to the dungeon, and since everyone was already there, they didn't delay any longer and entered it. It was a D-rank dungeon, and it was not as easy as it seemed at first glance. One of the guys used armor destruction after a while, and it worked perfectly. Suzukaze didn't think twice and used her bow, which she wielded masterfully. The girl fired a quick shot, and the arrows quickly caught up with the monster towering above them. Another guy also decided not to stand aside and rushed into the attack, using point focus. Saiki said that because it was very dangerous here now, it would be better for the guy to stay behind them all so as not to get hurt. The guy watched everyone from the sidelines and thought about when it would be best for him to join the fight. The orc decided to change tactics, and Suzukaze noticed that the monster was targeting their rear, but she couldn't allow that to happen. Saiki noticed that the monster was summoning its magic and realized that the orc was going to use its fire breath on the girl. He also realized that Suzukaze apparently hadn't seen this, and if he didn't intervene, everything would go wrong, so he could no longer just stand by. Suzukaze started screaming that they had warned him to stay away because it was very dangerous here. The guy replied that he simply couldn't ignore and pay no attention to the impending attack on her. Suzukaze was surprised by this because she hadn't actually noticed anything like that, and her inattention could have cost her dearly. At that moment, Saiki was glad that he had managed to prevent the monster from using its fire breath. The guy decided to continue and was going to try something else, hoping that it would work. He suddenly remembered how last night, sitting at home, he had been thinking about how to use his skill points as effectively as possible. The guy did not forget that he was now at level 10 and therefore had 9 points at his disposal. In other words, that meant 1 point for each level gained. Saiki found out that the first skills he could get were Fireball and Enhancement. When purchasing a skill, the corresponding skill tree is displayed, but first he must choose one of them. He knew that Fireball was well suited for medium and long-range combat. The guy thought that, on the other hand, Enhancement had no such limitations, and if something happened, it would be more useful at close range. He also found out that any skill obtained with the help of a forbidden restriction does not consume him. The guy realized that this meant he could use the enhancement anywhere and anytime, and he believed that such a skill would clearly be extremely useful to him. So in this case, he would spend 2 points. Saiki saw a notification pop up saying that he had received the enhancement, and that he had 7 points left. He then found another pretty good skill and realized that apparently the right branch was more geared towards close combat. Saiki decided that since skill points were unfortunately not infinite, he should focus on one thing. The guy decided that it would be best for him to focus on close combat, and that's what he applied to the orc. Saiki tried to dissuade him and explained that a novice without any skills should not do anything like this, and that it was all for his own safety. The guy replied that he was fine and said that even a nobody like him was capable of something. Saiki didn't hesitate any longer and used a sound wave attack that was incredibly powerful. The guy immediately received double experience for defeating a strong opponent, and thus his level was increased. All the guys stood there like orcs watching all this, unable to believe their eyes and not understanding what kind of power this was. The girl stood a little to the side and realized that this guy was definitely not fit for the role of an extra. Saeki gained 2 levels for defeating 1 orc, and compared to the Minotaur, it was the best he could hope for with the bonus experience. Suzukaze approached the guy and demanded an immediate answer, because he couldn't be that strong and most likely had some kind of skill. The guy bowed his head and decided to tell the girl that he had only acquired his skill yesterday. Suzukaze said that he should have told them about it at the very beginning, and insisted that he not hide anything like that again. The girl explained that everyone in the group had to look out for each other, and if something happened to him, it would be too late. The guy immediately apologized to the girl for his actions, and she was glad that Saiki understood everything correctly. The girl also casually mentioned that he had saved her after all, and she was very grateful to him for that no matter what. One of the guys standing on the sidelines thought about it and told the others that he didn't expect Saiki-san to be so strong, and that the saddest thing was that now they would have to divide the loot equally. Takai, on the other hand, thought it was great news, because if Saiki-san was that strong, they would be able to clear the dungeon much faster. This guy finally realized what he had done, and understood that he had been too rude, so he apologized to Saeki for his harsh words. Saiki also apologized to all of them and said that he should have warned them in advance, and not arranged such surprises. He decided to tell them precisely because, upon learning the truth, they could reject his application for membership. The guy held Seki-san back for just a minute and said with all seriousness that from now on, they were counting on him. Saiki replied that he would do his best, and the guys shook hands, considering that their raid had gone very smoothly. After a while, they were able to defeat the dungeon boss, and they did it with Saiki's participation. Saeki's experience points earned for the dungeon doubled, and as a result, he was able to reach level 17. After fighting the monsters, the guys breathed a sigh of relief because they had succeeded. Takai suddenly said that they had done an incredible job, and praised Saiki because he had also contributed, and his abilities had exceeded all their expectations. Saiki didn't quite agree with this, as he believed that the others' contributions were much greater than his own. One of the guys said that in any case, they were all great, and now they could safely return to the guild and celebrate to the fullest. He was already climbing the stairs when suddenly one of his comrades caught up with him, and did something that no one expected. This comrade simply took advantage of the situation, and launched his attack when no one was ready for it. It was a very mean and low act, since they had just recently fought back-to-back with monsters. The traitor was a guy named Ozawa, and it was his attack that sent his comrade to the other world. Takai flew into a rage because he couldn't understand how someone could do such a thing, and most importantly, why. Ozawa asked Takai not to make such a scary face because a sparkling smile is much better. Takai shouted menacingly at Ozawa to shut up immediately and told the other guys not to interfere. The man wanted to deal with this traitor himself because he wouldn't be able to sleep unless he personally sent Ozawa to the other world. Suzukaze disagreed because she believed that now was not the time for such talk. Saiki, on the other hand, didn't mind standing aside and watching. Saiki also said that he understood perfectly well because he too had things he would never give up. The girl didn't understand what Saiki was talking about because she was convinced that it wasn't worth it for Takai to risk his life alone. Saiki said that from a logical point of view, this was indeed true, but the world was full of illogical things, such as the desire to take revenge on someone for the loss of a loved one. Suzukaze understood what the guy was trying to explain to her, but she still thought it was a very stupid idea. Takai thanked the guys for their understanding and asked them to hand the guy over to him anyway. Saiki was focused and very attentive to every detail, paying attention to absolutely everything. The guy noticed that Ozawa's weapon looked very dangerous, and he assumed that the guy had sent quite a few people to the other world with it. This knife had a destructive pulse effect and a bonus of 5 for each person sent to the other world, and there were no limits to this effect. Now this knife was much stronger than it was originally. Ozawa sneered and said that Takai was wrong to think he could win this fight. Takai could no longer restrain himself and rushed into the attack, intending to avenge his friend. The man was surprised because he was sure that his strength would be enough to break through the guy's defense, and apparently Ozawa had been hiding his skill all this time. Takai first assumed that Ozawa had an S rank, but then realized that his rank was definitely higher. Ozawa knew that Takai used a longsword, which might have been effective against monsters, but certainly not against people because it was quite slow. The traitor took advantage of this weakness and launched his fast and powerful attack. Ozawa was completely confident and knew that Takai would not be able to defeat him because their strengths were clearly not equal. Takai suddenly took something out of his pocket, and it was a vial of a certain potion that he had been saving for a special occasion. The man remembered receiving this potion as a birthday gift, and he learned about its effects a little later. At the time, Takai couldn't accept the potion as a gift, partly because he thought it was probably very expensive. Suzuki was the one who gave Takai the potion, and the young man said that even though it was expensive, he wanted to repay the man for everything he had done for him. Suzuki believed that their bond was unbreakable. Takai sincerely thanked Suzuki for such an expensive and valuable gift. Suzuki told Takai to use this potion only in extreme cases because being an adventurer is very hard work. Takai did not hesitate any longer and drank the potion in one gulp, hoping that it would help him. Ozawa laughed and told the man that now was not the right time to restore his health, adding that the man was apparently not very smart. A moment later, Takai knocked the guy off his feet with a single swing, which Ozawa definitely didn't expect and didn't understand how it happened. Takai stood firmly on his feet, clutching his sword, and was determined to get even with this traitor. It was Hercules' potion, and when used, it doubled the attack power for 5 minutes. Any actions taken under the influence of this potion were performed without hindrance, and subsequently the attack power decreased every 5 minutes. Ozawa realized that it was time to put jokes aside for a while and finally teach the cocky Takai a lesson. He decided to use a silent step, which came as a big surprise to Takai as it made it more difficult for him to fight. Takai couldn't help but notice how fast Ozawa was, and yet at the same time, he was practically silent and invisible. The man began to realize that everything was apparently useless, and Ozawa made it clear that of the two of them, only he was stronger and faster. Takai mentally apologized to Suzuki because most likely he would never be able to avenge him. The girl who was watching all this from the sidelines realized that she could no longer just stand by and do nothing, and fired her quick shot. Ozawa easily dodged the attack and remained completely unharmed. The traitor turned to the girl and said that she had been wrong to disobey her comrade and decide to intervene in their fight after all. Suzukaze looked very frightened because Ozawa had approached her too quickly. Ozawa said that the girl was to blame and that he simply had to teach her a lesson, or more precisely, send Suzukaze to the other world. When Ozawa swung to attack the girl, Saiki suddenly and unexpectedly stopped him from doing so. Ozawa was very surprised that Saiki-san was able to stop his knife, as it was practically impossible. Saiki decided to ask Takai if he would mind if he dealt with the man himself. Takai replied that he was not against it at all, and, on the contrary, he would be very grateful to the guy if he did it for him. Saiki looked at Ozawa and said that there was probably no need to repeat himself, as he had heard everything perfectly well. Ozawa did not understand why Saiki thought he was so powerful that he even allowed himself to think that he could defeat him, since the guy was just a background character. Saiki did not comment on these words, but simply fired a quick shot intended for Ozawa. The guy just said that none of Ozawa's words scared him in the slightest. Ozawa was angry and yelled at Saiki to stop bragging, because he had only recently acquired his skill. Saiki understood that Ozawa's speed and weapon were a big problem, so now was not the time to stand on ceremony with him. Ozawa wanted to show the guy his place, because to him he was just a nobody, a meaningless extra. He attacked Saiki and was sure that this would be the end and that he would ultimately be victorious. Saiki surprised him once again by blocking his attack, and Ozawa noted that he had quite sharp eyes. Ozawa couldn't believe that Saiki had managed to stop even this attack, because it was practically impossible. Saiki said that everything was as it should be, because the person who launched this attack was not such a big threat anyway. Ozawa was surprised by such self-confidence and did not understand why Saiki was so assertive. He said he was pleasantly surprised by Saki's attitude, but thanks to that he would get his bonus when he destroyed the guy. Ozawa was ready to bet Saiki that he would never be able to keep up with his speed. Saiki realized that he should have explained everything in simpler terms from the beginning. He told Ozawa that his speed was no threat to him. Ozawa still didn't believe these words and therefore used rapid acceleration, hoping for a positive outcome for himself. Suzukaze watched the boys from the sidelines and couldn't believe her eyes because Saiki really was that strong. Ozawa looked at the guy and couldn't believe that he had managed to catch up with him. He also appreciated Sakai's sword skills and defensive movements, which were a level above those of a typical beginner. On top of that, he felt something else, and it was impossible not to react to it. Ozawa could feel the guy's incredible aura, which was overwhelming in itself. He also sensed that Saiki surpassed him in many other ways, so Ozawa tried to understand who this guy was. Saiki simply replied that he was just like Ozawa himself and called him nothing more than an ordinary extra. Ozawa was sure that he was superior to this guy in all respects, but he couldn't understand why Saiki was so intimidating, and most importantly, he didn't understand how to defeat him. Suddenly, he came up with an idea, and a smile lit up his face, but this smile did not bode well. A moment later, Ozawa used his speed to head in the opposite direction, pursuing a goal known only to him. Suzuha felt someone behind her, then saw a hand and heard a voice that belonged to Ozawa, who advised the girl to be obedient and not do anything stupid. Saiki did not ignore this, and did not allow the villain to carry out his plan, considering it a very dirty move and unworthy of respect. The guy attacked Ozawa and did it successfully, and it was practically impossible to dodge or block this attack. Saiki told him that this move was obvious to him, and that it was a despicable plan worthy of a coward like him. Ozawa didn't want to listen to these lectures and believed that this was far from over, and that Saiki would soon answer for all his words. Saiki suddenly smiled and decided to inform Ozawa that he would no longer be able to use his skill, and that the game was over. Ozawa began to insult Saiki and demanded an immediate answer as to what he had done to him. Saiki decided to explain a little and said that skills and spells are similar and require He said that he had attacked his most vulnerable point, the mana channel in his body, and thus stopped the flow of his mana. That was why Ozawa couldn't use his skill. Ozawa was very upset because he couldn't win with his speed, and now he couldn't use his skills either. A little earlier, he couldn't even imagine that this Aiki-san would be able to corner him in a way that seemed to have no way out. Ozawa paused for a moment, thought everything over, and suddenly called Saiki, saying that he was ready to share some interesting information with him. Saiki didn't fully understand what information Ozawa was talking about, but he couldn't hide his tension and excitement. Ozawa said that Saiki should use this dagger to kill him, because then the dagger would become stronger. He added that killing people gives you much more experience than killing monsters. The guy also decided to reveal that everyone was carefully hiding this fact so that adventurers wouldn't start killing each other. The girl stood a little to the side, but she still heard everything Ozawa said and was shocked at how easily he took it all. Ozawa decided to give the dagger to Saiki and advised the guy to destroy it first. He was also sure that after that, Saiki would be able to find out what it was and would be happy to receive a kind of reward in return. Saiki finally understood why Ozawa sent people to their deaths, and did it without hesitation. Ozawa did not argue and replied that this was indeed the case, and that he was ready for the young man to deal with him. Saiki looked at the guy for a few minutes and then decided to say that he sincerely felt sorry for Ozawa, and even sympathized with him a little. He also told Ozawa that he could understand some of his feelings because, judging by everything, he couldn't escape this damn desire to become stronger. Saiki also realized that if it weren't for the forbidden restriction for Kotoha's sake, he himself could have become just like Ozawa. In his past life, the guy had seen many people who did not have to choose the path by which they became stronger. Ozawa got angry because he thought that Saiki knew nothing about him and had no right to talk like that. He wanted Saiki to just send him to the other world and end it all, but Saiki was categorically against it and said he would not do anything like that. Ozawa didn't understand why the guy was refusing, since Saiki himself said that he understood some of his feelings. Saiki said that was true, and moreover, he believed that he and Ozawa were very similar in some ways. The girl heard all these words and didn't understand what Saiki was talking about, and what it meant. The guy thought for a moment and then decided to share his thoughts, saying that if he did that, he would no longer be able to be himself, and was sure that because of this, he would lose an important part of himself, so he would not do it. Ozawa said he thought it was foolish and very naive, and at that moment, a strange coin appeared in his mouth. A moment later, there was something like a small explosion, and Saiki realized that it was probably a smoke bomb. Ozawa grabbed his dagger and told the guy that in that case, he would force him to discard this news. He wanted to use his dagger to do everything himself and thus become a kind of trigger. Saiki couldn't let that happen, so he stopped the guy from carrying out his plan. He believed that before Ozawa went to the other world, he should first atone for all his sins. Saiki neutralized Ozawa and tied the guy's hands and feet tightly so that he could no longer harm anyone, including himself. Suzukaze approached Saiki and looked slightly frightened because she did not understand what the guy meant when he said that he and Ozawa were alike, because she did not think so at all. The girl simply saw that Seiki's desire to save Ozawa's life remained unshakable until the very end, and he even thought about saving him. Saiki was pleased that apparently the girl was worried about him and had just unconsciously admitted it. Suzukaze had no intention of hiding it and replied to the guy that, of course, she was worried about him, and there was a moment when he scared her very much. Saiki sincerely apologized to the girl for this and thanked her for her concern. Suzukaze thanked him in return for saving her, saying that it meant a lot to her. After a while, the guys called in special organizations that arrested Ozawa. Takai was deeply moved that Saiki-san had saved him, and was very grateful to the guy for that. While in the hospital, Takai said that Suzuki was only unharmed thanks to Saiki, and that it was incredible. He said that when Ozawa suddenly attacked Suzuki, he was literally a millimeter away from hitting his vital organs. Thanks to the fact that the fight with Ozawa ended fairly quickly, Suzuki was able to be taken to the hospital in time to receive all the necessary care, and it was all thanks to Saiki. After a while, the case could be considered closed. Suzukaze was sitting there waiting when suddenly someone handed her a can of coffee. Saiki approached the girl and said that they only had black coffee and hoped that it would suit her. Suzukaze replied that black coffee would suit her just fine, and asked the guy not to treat her like a child. The girl took a sip of the coffee, and the guy saw that she definitely didn't like it, but she stubbornly refused to show it or admit it. Saiki sat down next to the girl on the sofa and asked what Suzukaze wanted to know from him. The girl lowered her eyes to the floor and quietly said that she wanted to know the secret of his strength. Saiki replied that there was no secret, but he was curious to know why the girl was working as an adventurer at such a young age, since she looked like a middle school student. The girl forcefully placed her coffee can on the table and asked him if it was really that important. Suzukaze added that she was actually a high school senior, and she had a very intimidating appearance. Saiki looked at her and realized that he had been wrong in his assumptions, and that she was older than Kotoha. The girl didn't understand who Seiki was talking about, so he explained that Kotoha was his younger sister. Suzukaze was surprised that the guy had a sister, and a younger one at that, because that explained a lot. She replied that the guy was full of calmness and prudence, and all this simply screamed that he was a reliable older brother. Saiki didn't quite understand how to respond to these words and assumed that it was a kind of compliment from the girl. Suzukaze replied that it was a compliment to him, and added that she was impressed by the guy's fighting power and his instant adaptability. Saiki was even a little embarrassed by such pleasant words directed at him, and it made him a little uncomfortable. Suzukaze said that this was precisely why she would very much like Saiki to share the secret of his strength with her, and called him a cute older brother. Saiki asked her to stop immediately and added that he would have nightmares about it later. The girl was not going to back down and begged him to show her his true power, because she was sure that there was some kind of secret in it. Saiki realized that he needed to respond more directly, so he rephrased his answer and told her that he would never reveal his secret. The girl was upset and did not expect such a categorical refusal, calling the guy simply greedy. Suzukaze decided to add that no girl would want to date such a cold guy. The girl suddenly asked the guy for permission to look at his hand, which was a strange request for the guy himself. Saiki didn't understand what she wanted, but he became a little curious himself, so he held out his hand to her. Suzukaze did something to his hand and the girl looked very focused and serious. A few minutes later, the girl showed the guy her work, which was his carefully bandaged finger, which he had probably injured a little during the fight with Ozawa. Saiki saw that this girl was too carefree, and he didn't think that something like this could confuse him. Suzukaze saw the guy smile and couldn't believe he was capable of such a thing, but she couldn't help but notice that the smile suited him very well. Saiki immediately pulled himself together and told the girl that it was all in her imagination, and that the most she could have seen was a slight smirk and nothing more. Suzukaze replied that it was essentially the same thing, and said that, in principle, it was to be expected, since such a lovely high school girl was courting him. The girl said that she no longer considered the guy to be such a bore, and Saiki thanked her for this peculiar compliment. Suzukaze took out her phone and asked the guy to leave his contact information because she had so many questions for him, for example, about strategy and so on. Saiki replied that if that was all, he didn't mind exchanging contact information, and would be happy to help the girl anytime. Suzukaze smiled slyly and suggested that they go to the dungeon together next time. Saiki didn't refuse the girl's request, but replied that he would only do so if he had free time. Suzukaze noticed that based on his words, he was still willing to help her, but not at any time. The group was already dispersing when the girl remembered something, and called out to the guy that next time she really wanted to meet his younger sister, Kotoha. Suzukaze was sure that since they were the same age, they would definitely become friends. Saiki didn't mind the suggestion and was sure that Kotoha would also like the idea. The guy was already at home after a long day at work when something suddenly caught his attention. His cell phone lit up with a message from Kotoha asking how her brother was doing. Kotoha sent a photo and wrote that her sister was angry with her for playing games for too long. Saiki looked at the photo and thought that he would definitely cure his sister as soon as he could. Suddenly he heard Yori, and his phone suddenly flashed with multicolored smoke, which was a big surprise to him. The guy saw a fairy in front of him who was clearly unhappy about something, and began to tell him what she had warned him about earlier. She reminded him that he had promised her a bath and 2 snacks a day, and that there would always be ice cream in the refrigerator. The fairy said that of all the things on the list, he had only prepared the bath, and she was not willing to tolerate such a negligent attitude. The guy replied that he had simply forgotten about all of this. The fairy considered this to be very rude and threatened him that she would make sure he could no longer use the forbidden restriction. Saiki apologized and said that he had just been very busy today, but tomorrow he would definitely take care of everything. The fairy considered the guy hopeless, but suddenly said that she was giving him one last chance, and hoped that he would not miss it. She thought that the guy was nothing but trouble so far, but despite this, since she was a very generous fairy, she was ready to share some great news with him. Saiki didn't quite understand what news she was talking about, and it even scared him a little because he didn't know what else to expect from this fairy. The fairy proudly announced that she had added the key to the secret dungeon to the item exchange. Saiki couldn't quite believe that he had heard and understood correctly, because if that was the case, it was really big news. The fairy decided to clarify that it was the key to a very complex dungeon, and that only he had access to this dungeon. Saiki thought it all sounded very interesting, and the fairy advised the guy to click on it himself to make sure. After pressing it, the guy actually saw that there were many different ranks, and decided to ask about a discount that also appeared in the system window. The fairy explained that it was fuel for him to be able to buy more and more things. She added that they appear because people in this world cannot resist the word discount. Saiki concluded that the fairy had really gotten used to this world. The fairy said that it was completely useless to praise her and told the guy to use the key so that he could finally level up. The guy didn't need to be asked twice and focused all his attention on the system window. Saiki noticed that even with the discount, the S-rank dungeon cost 1,000,000 yen, and he could certainly afford it considering how much he would earn, but still. The fairy decided to tell him that the enemies in the secret dungeon would be much stronger than usual. She said that because of this, he would be able to gain more experience for the forbidden restriction. The fairy added that with the buff, he would be able to get even more out of the secret dungeon, and since he would have to go there alone, the difficulty would be quite high, but she was sure that it would be easier than easy for him. She wanted to say that the more squeaking, the greater the reward. That is, even considering that it would be a C-rank dungeon, its difficulty would still be many times greater. The fairy looked at the guy and assumed that he was apparently scared and not ready to take such a risk. Saiki replied that he was not afraid, and that for now he would save money to buy a key to the B-rank dungeon for 5 million yen. She listened to him and said that he was truly a very interesting person, and decided that in that case there was no need to rush. The fairy also told him that he could use the item exchange to sell things from the dungeons. The fairy explained that this way he would be able to recoup his losses, because the forbidden restriction was actually very useful. She told the guy to pay attention and realize how great the legacy of his past life was. Saiki decided that he should definitely thank his former self. He ended up using the key to the secret dungeon of rank C and approached the door. The fairy did not expect the boy to be ready to go there right away, since he had just returned from the dungeon. Saiki replied very confidently that he was completely ready, and added that he didn't want to waste another second. The fairy was happy because she saw that the guy had finally gotten into the swing of things, and was now completely ready to devote himself to the cause. The guy didn't think so and was generally sure that nothing had really changed and everything was as usual. The fairy said that at that moment it was simply the real archmage speaking through him. Saiki thanked Sphere and said that thanks to her he would become stronger in the blink of an eye. The fairy replied that he would thank her when he returned from the dungeon unharmed, and that for now it was unnecessary. Saiki decided to joke and said that if he suddenly went to the other world, he would not be able to do so. The fairy looked at him intently and said that it wasn't a very good joke, adding that she didn't seem to be going to the other world anytime soon, so he could go. She called after him that when he returned he would have to buy her ice cream. Saiki had no objection, so he agreed without hesitation, and reached for the door to finally open it. The guy didn't back down and finally opened the door that led to the basement, and Saiki didn't know what surprise awaited him there. At that moment, Kotoha woke up because she was feeling strange and unwell. The girl saw that when she coughed, she had stained her hands, and now she wanted to get out of the hospital bed to wash them thoroughly. Kotoha could hardly move, and getting out of bed was not as easy as she had thought. The nurses heard a strange noise coming from the girl's room and decided to check on her to make sure everything was okay, but unfortunately, that was not the case. The girl was lying on the floor practically unconscious, and one of the nurses immediately ran to get the doctor so that he could provide Kotoha with the necessary assistance. The nurses tried to revive the girl, but she only called softly for her brother. Saiki, meanwhile, unsuspecting, found himself somewhere in the forest, looking around. The boy noticed that this forest was different from the ones he had seen before, and he realized that he needed to be very careful and watch for any signs of monsters. Saiki looked around and saw something growing on a tree. Looking closer, he realized that it was Lenaha fruit. The guy couldn't believe he was actually seeing them, but the system window confirmed it. Saiki thought that in his past life, he could never have imagined that these fruits grew here. He knew that Lena fruit was used in alchemy, but it wasn't exactly rare, and he realized there was no point in stopping to pick it. However, Saiki thought that if Lenaha fruits grew here, then that monster might also be here. The guy remembered that the monster was very fast, so he could gain more experience from it. Saiki decided to give it a try anyway, and a moment later he used a sound wave attack. The guy decided not to stop there and added acceleration to all this. Saiki caught a glimpse of it and realized he was right, which meant he wouldn't have to stop to reap the benefits. The guy rushed forward as fast as he could, and it was an incredible speed. The creature was ahead and was even faster, and it looked like a small, cute toy. Saiki realized that in his current state, he would never be able to catch up with this turbo rat. The guy was trying to come up with something when a small, multicolored flash appeared in front of him. The fairy appeared in an instant, and the flash was her doing. She also decided to offer the guy a way out. Saiki was very surprised because he did not know that the sphere could appear even in the dungeon, and this was pleasant news for him. The fairy replied that she couldn't do this in ordinary dungeons, but since this dungeon was secret and prepared especially for him, it was possible for her. The sphere said that the guy was wrong to think that she couldn't get in here because she was the one who controlled the forbidden restriction. The fairy added that she was very bored sitting at home and was very worried about the boy, so she decided that she had to help him. Saiki was grateful to her for her help. Saiki racked his brain and suddenly remembered that Itzenia was a very predatory plant. The fairy confirmed this and added that these plants always try to eat everything they see. She suggested luring the rat to these plants, and then they would do all the work for him. Saiki listened carefully and decided that it was worth trying to do everything as the fairy had advised. A bunch of monsters got together in a pack, and they were all chasing one guy with one goal in mind: to destroy him. Saiki clearly realized that his situation had become very bad, because getting rid of that pack of monsters would not be as easy as he would like. The fairy assessed the situation and suggested that because of these monsters, they might lose their runner. Sphere suddenly noticed that there were Itsini living ahead and informed the guy about it. Saiki was happy to hear this news and really hoped that their plan would still work out. The monster suddenly began to make some very strange sounds that resembled squeaks. The guy guessed that this monster had simply run out of fuel because it had no opportunity to eat Lenaha fruit to replenish its strength. This was perfect for him because he would finally be able to catch her and wanted to do it right there. The creature tried to escape, but Saiki was already close to his goal. Only in this race, they didn't even notice where they had wandered off to. The fairy tried to warn him of the danger, but unfortunately it was already too late. In an instant, huge jaws snapped shut and Saiki was inside that mouth with the rat. It was the jaw of some strange plant that could swallow almost anything. Unexpectedly, the boy's level increased, and at that moment, a powerful explosion occurred inside the plant. Saiki managed to get out and was pleased that he had managed to increase his level. The fairy was happy to see the guy safe and sound because she was very worried about him. Saiki looked around and realized that he probably shouldn't count on a break. The guy was surrounded on all sides by different kinds of monsters that were eager to take revenge on him. The fairy thought that the guy should retreat and change his tactics. Saiki replied that there was no need for that because he was ready to deal with these monsters here and now. He felt different because he had become stronger and therefore more confident. The guy used his powers and, thanks to his abilities, created something like a fireball. Saiki was about to attack these monsters and was very attentive and focused. He was able to make a Crimson Lotus fire step, and it flew into the monsters, which had already gathered in considerable numbers. After a few minutes, everything around was completely engulfed in fire, and it was impossible for these monsters to escape. Saiki decided to look at the system window and saw that he had gained 20 levels for this battle, which was a very good result. The fairy realized that helping this guy wasn't so easy, and she shared these conclusions with him. Saiki replied that he thought he had heard her dissatisfaction somewhere behind him the whole time. She didn't like these words and began to get angry, but the guy decided to soften the situation and simply said that everything was fine. The fairy decided not to get into a conflict and concluded that she hadn't heard anything from the guy. The guy smiled and thought to himself that his fairy was very sensitive but also too loud. The fairy assessed the recent battles and said that since the first fight with that turbo rat, they had made considerable progress, and not everyone was capable of that. She told the guy to make sure he had collected all the dropped items so as not to miss anything. The guy looked at the system window and saw that there were too many rare items there. The fairy thought this was logical since the chance of rare items dropping in secret dungeons is quite high. He suddenly pointed to a rare item called lizard steel and decided to ask the fairy what she thought about it. She replied that if he sold this steel for cash, he could easily earn several million. The guy couldn't believe that just one item was worth millions because it was very expensive. He considered this to be good news because if he continued to visit these dungeons, he would quickly become a millionaire. The fairy explained that this was the only B rank dungeon he could visit because there is only one key for each rank. The guy realized that in that case, next time he would just have to go to a B rank dungeon. The fairy thought he was too cocky and advised him not to forget that there was a huge difference between B and C ranks. Saiki suddenly assessed the situation around him and realized that apparently they had no time left to relax and chat. The guy saw a strange creature right in front of him, and it didn't promise anything good. The fairy immediately recognized this monster, whose name was Naga, and who was the boss of this secret dungeon. There was a certain recommended level to try to fight this monster. It was level 150, which was very high, and the guy had not yet reached that level. Saiki, on the other hand, believed that this monster would be an excellent handicap. The fairy did not understand what the guy was talking about, and what he had in mind was clearly not reasonable. She said that they had already achieved their goal and there was no need to fight this monster anymore. The guy replied that he didn't think Spear was such a panic monger, and explained to her that defeating this creature would be the shortest way to help his sister Kotoha. Saiki tried to calm the fairy down and said that she had nothing to worry about, adding that this Naga was nothing more than a source of experience. He knew that Naga's skin had one special feature: it could absorb any magic. These creatures were known to many as the sworn enemies of all magicians. The guy was sure that everything would be fine as long as he could use physical attacks, so he immediately applied the enhancement. Saiki didn't stop there and immediately added acceleration to the enhancement and rushed to attack the monster. He attacked with his sword, but it had no effect on the monster, which easily parried the blow. Saiki realized that his sword, which was designed for beginners, was simply unable to cut through its thick skin. The creature, which resembled a large snake, attacked the young man with some kind of liquid that was clearly poisonous. Saiki managed to jump out of the way at the last moment. This unknown substance splattered all over the ground, and the fairy saw that the ground beneath him began to melt. The guy concluded from all this that Nagi's poison was capable of melting anything, and therefore he should stay as far away from it as possible. He was well aware that if he was hit by any attack from this monster, it would be the end for him, so he had to be very careful. Saiki realized that he hadn't been this nervous in a long time, and decided to use his storage box. Thanks to a forbidden restriction, he could store and retrieve items from a separate dimension. Saiki took a weapon out of his storage, and it was an axe, and with it, he rushed to attack the monster. The fairy was surprised by the guy because he had almost completely mastered the forbidden restriction she had taught him. The monster was very close, and he also wanted to deal with this person as soon as possible. Saiki chose the most opportune moment and prepared to attack the monster, hoping that this time he would succeed. The attack was so powerful that everything sparkled around him, and the guy looked very serious at that moment. The axe made direct contact with its target, but it failed to cause any damage. The guy thought that considering the difference in their characteristics, it turned out that he couldn't even hurt it. At that moment, the fairy warned the guy that the monster was starting to attack him. Saiki saw that his weapon had simply broken in two after this attack, which came as a surprise to him. The guy got angry at Naga for breaking his axe, which he could have sold for a decent amount of money. Saiki realized that no matter what weapon he used, it would not affect the monster. The guy suddenly decided that it was worth taking the risk and that it would be all or nothing, but he was determined to at least try. Saiki moved to the very center and got as close to the monster as he could. He was almost at his target and used a sonic attack as his decisive move. It was a fireball of Crimson Lotus and it exploded, engulfing everything in flames. The fairy decided to remind the guy that Nagam's magic was not scary, and thus he only replenished her mana. Saiki replied that he had a plan, and was sure that the monster must have a limit to the amount of magic it could absorb. He thought that if he could overcome it, Nagi would be in trouble, and since the forbidden restriction allowed him to use spells without spending Ohm, it would work in his favor. Saiki used the Crimson Lot fireball spell over and over again, hoping that his guesses were correct. The fairy also made sure that they were not spending any Ohm, but she believed that this could not continue. She explained that using so many spells in such a short period of time would put a great strain on his body. The guy replied that all these consequences could not compare to the feeling he would have if he lost Koto. Something incredible began to happen. The entire monster was engulfed in flames, and from the outside it looked terrifying. The creature began to disintegrate on the spot, all because the guy didn't stop and stubbornly followed his plan. Saiki saw what was happening to the monster and thought it was great news, but he also thought that he had probably exceeded his limit. The fairy noticed this too and decided to cheer the guy up, shouting at him not to give up because there was only a little left and she believed that he would definitely succeed. The monster sensed and understood all this, but he had no intention of giving up and tried to attack the boy again. Saiki was very exhausted and practically without strength, but he knew for sure that his victory was close. With his last ounce of strength, he used a Crimson Lotus Fireball, and in an instant, the entire monster was engulfed in flames. There was a powerful explosion and many small stones scattered everywhere, and at that moment, the guy's level increased, which meant that the creature had been destroyed. As a reward, Seiki received another poisoned blade from Nagi, which had a special effect. It could inflict poison on an opponent for a certain amount of time. The guy was very happy with this reward, even though it did not come as easily as he would have liked. The fairy hurried to her Iori to find out if he was alright, as she was very worried about him. The guy replied that she shouldn't worry so much about him because he was fine. The fairy praised the guy for a job well done. The fairy said that the guy could go rest now because he had defeated the boss, which meant that he would soon be automatically transported outside. She suddenly realized that Saiki wasn't listening to him because he had become strong and fatigue had taken its toll. After a while, the fairy realized that she had made a mistake, but she couldn't fix it anymore. She had made a mistake because she had entered the wrong coordinates, and so they returned from the dungeon, but not to their home. The fairy suddenly heard a noise from the side and realized that someone was coming, but she couldn't let anyone find her. She apologized to the guy even though he couldn't hear her, and immediately disappeared, dissolving into colorful smoke. The girl was walking home down the street when she suddenly saw someone sitting on the ground, apparently unconscious. That person was her recent acquaintance, Amami. Amami recognized the guy as Iori almost immediately and couldn't understand how he ended up in this place or why he wasn't responding. After a while, Saiki woke up and opened his eyes, and he tried for a long time to understand where he was. He looked around and the room was unfamiliar to him, but it appeared to be a girl's room. Saiki decided to touch the bedding, and when he heard it crinkle, he knew for sure that it was a woman's bedroom. Amami entered the room and saw that the guy had finally woken up, which made her feel somewhat relieved. Saiki did not expect to see the girl and did not remember how he ended up in this house, but he began to guess that this room most likely belonged to Amami. The girl said that she was walking down the street when she suddenly saw the guy lying unconscious and looking very pale. Saiki realized that the girl had saved him and was very grateful to her for that, because anything could have happened. Amami replied that his gratitude was unnecessary, and that the most important thing was that Saiki was okay. The girl wanted to know why the guy was unconscious and completely unresponsive. Saiki began to say that he had decided to try to go to the C-rank dungeon alone, and in the end he succeeded, but he was too exhausted. The guy decided that it was better not to talk about the secret dungeon. Amami was surprised that Saiki had gone to the C-rank dungeon alone, and said that he was very lucky to have survived after everything that had happened. The guy was very grateful to the girl for taking him in and not leaving him on the street. Amami noticed that there had been many incidents recently involving awakened people, or more precisely, people who had acquired skills. The girl suddenly pointed out to the guy where his personal belongings were, but warned him that his phone was unfortunately broken. Saiki thanked the girl for this too because he saw that she was very attentive and kind to him. Amami was about to leave the room but decided to offer the guy some porridge she had just made. The guy did not expect to be offered food, but he was not going to refuse because he was actually very hungry. Amami told the guy that she still hadn't repaid him for saving her in the dungeon. The guy reminded her of what he had told her earlier, namely that she shouldn't worry about anything at all, and since she wanted to, he would let her take care of him now. The girl didn't mind, so she ran off to prepare porridge for the guy, leaving him alone in her room. Seki sat and waited, thinking about how kind and smart she was. Suddenly, the guy saw something at the other end of the room, and upon closer inspection, he recognized it as underwear. Saiki saw that the underwear was sticking out, and guessed that the noise was caused by Amami stuffing everything into that box. Amami returned to the room and apologized to the guy for making him wait, and suddenly she saw what Saiki was staring at so intently. She rushed over and closed the door as quickly as possible so that nothing else could be seen. Amami blushed deeply with embarrassment and asked Seki if he had seen it. Saiki replied that he didn't understand what she was talking about, so as not to embarrass Amami even more. The girl didn't believe him, so Saiki said that even if he had seen something, it was only a little and she shouldn't worry. She was upset and very embarrassed by the situation, which could not be changed. Amami knew that she was the only one to blame for not cleaning the room properly. The girl pointed to the table where there was a plate of porridge prepared especially for the guy. She told the guy to eat before the food got cold and asked him to forget what had just happened. The guy thought he couldn't say that to the girl, but he was sure that this memory would stay in his head for a long time. Saiki thanked the girl again and began to eat the food she had prepared especially for him. He tasted the porridge and found it to be very delicious and delicate in flavor. Amami decided to share and told the guy that she had added one secret ingredient, which was grated ginger. She also said that when she was little and got sick, she often asked her mother to make her this porridge. The guy realized that this was the Amami family's secret recipe. Saiki suddenly thought about it and decided to ask the girl if she lived separately from her parents. The girl replied that her parents had died in a monster attack 7 years ago. She remembered the moment when her mom and dad tried with all their might to protect their little daughter. Amami saw everything, but because she had successfully hidden and sat quietly in her shelter, she was able to survive. The boy apologized for apparently stirring up unpleasant memories for the girl. The girl replied that he shouldn't worry because a lot of time had passed and she was no longer bothered by it. The guy suggested that this was probably the reason she wanted to become an adventurer. Amami replied that this was partly true, but she also wanted as many people as possible to avoid suffering the same fate as she had. She said that, in addition to this, she had wanted to become an adventurer since childhood in order to be amazing, and she also really wanted to become just as strong. That's why she tried to get the guy to take her as his apprentice so she could learn the necessary skills. She understood that she might not be cut out to be an adventurer, but she still wanted to give it her all for her own sake. The guy understood that Amami would most likely continue to try to become an adventurer, no matter what difficulties stood in her way. He also noticed that instead of acting in her own interests, she was trying to act based on her beliefs. A moment later, Saiki knelt down in front of the girl and bowed his head low. Amami was frightened and didn't understand why the guy was kneeling in front of her, trying to figure out what was going on. The guy told the girl that last time he thought she wasn't cut out to be an adventurer, but now he wanted to take back his words. Saiki turned to the girl and asked if she would like to become his student if she didn't mind. Amami was surprised because she had never dreamed of anything like this and couldn't believe what she was hearing. The guy believed that the most important thing for an adventurer was not strength or talent, but courage, and he was sure that the girl had plenty of it. Saiki added that since the girl was so brave, he wanted to help her become an adventurer. The guy said that he was quite busy at the moment and would need some time before he could start training her if she didn't mind. Amami knelt down in front of the guy and said she was very grateful to him for this opportunity. The girl said that if he was really okay with someone like her, she would very much like to become his student. The guy believed that he would definitely make her a first-class sorceress and would make every effort to do so. Amami agreed and said that she really wanted to learn and promised to try her best. The girl was ready to wait as long as necessary to begin their work together. After a while, Saiki was back in his apartment and immediately decided to look at the system window, where he saw that he had managed to get a lot of different things, including equipment that was considered a rare drop. He saw that he had 2 of them and was sure that selling one of them would not hurt him, but he wanted to keep the rest for himself and use them. The guy remembered that the weapon he used in the battle with Naga was already broken and considered himself very lucky to have obtained a rare item, so he decided that he would definitely equip it. Saiki decided that he would definitely need to find out more about its characteristics. In the system window, he saw that his level had increased significantly. The fairy saw that the guy now looked more or less like SSS-Rank, but warned him that he still had a long way to go, though she said that his rate of growth was pleasantly surprising. She also wanted to praise the guy for how he distributed his skill points and thought that his new spell suited him perfectly. Saiki thanked the fairy for the compliment, but wanted to know how much he could get for selling his loot. The boy saw that he could get 70 million yen for all of it, which was a large sum. Saiki couldn't believe his luck because it meant that his goal of 500 million yen was getting closer. The fairy was sitting with her long-awaited ice cream when suddenly the guy's cell phone rang, and she immediately told him about it. The guy was surprised that the call came so quickly even though he had just repaired his phone. He saw that it was Dr. Kotohi calling and hurried to answer the call. The doctor was glad that he was finally able to reach Saiki and informed him that Kotohi's condition had recently deteriorated suddenly. He also told Saiki that at this rate she probably didn't have much time left. They thought it would be much better if Saiki stayed with Kotohi while she was still conscious. Saiki asked the doctor to give the phone to his younger sister Kotoha, and the doctor hurried to fulfill the boy's request. The young man heard the doctor address the girl and say that her brother Saiki wanted to talk to her. A few minutes later, Saiki heard his sister's voice, which was very weak, and this worried him greatly. Although Kotoha was very weak, she really wanted to talk to her brother, so she gathered her strength. Saiki immediately told his sister that she had to hold on a little longer, and added that he had already found a way to cure her. The doctor heard these statements from the boy and advised him not to make hasty, ill-considered decisions. The girl promised her brother that she would do everything possible and wait as long as necessary. Saiki thanked Kodo for her strength of will and said that there was only a little bit left to wait. The guy ended the conversation and immediately asked Sphere if she thought he could earn 500 million yen if he cleared the secret dungeon of rank A. Sphere replied that it was certainly possible, but there was a high probability that the guy would end up dead. The guy didn't argue with her, but said that he simply had to do it to help his younger sister. The fairy understood why Saiki was willing to take such a big risk and was very worried about him. Sphere said that challenging a secret dungeon of rank A when he had all the characteristics of rank C was madness, and believed that there was no way he could clear it. The fairy tried to dissuade him from such a crazy idea and asked the guy to think sensibly. Sphere saw no reaction from Saiki to her words and realized that despite all the risks, he would still go to the dungeon. Saiki said that was indeed the case and that he would go there no matter what, as he was running out of time. The fairy replied that in that case, she would not stop him, but instead would help him in any way she could. Saiki was grateful to Sphere for this and for any help, because he understood that he would most likely not be able to cope on his own. Saiki didn't waste any time and set off, and a few moments later, he was able to see what the secret dungeon of rank A looked like. The fairy began to tell the boy that he would clear the dungeon by passing through the 5 floors of the tower and defeating the boss on the top floor. Saiki replied that he understood their plan and thought that it would probably take a long time to grind. The fairy told the guy that there were safe zones in this tower where monsters would not be able to detect him, and she also asked him to provide her with navigation. The guy said that this gave him some hope, but the fairy said that first of all, he would have to fight someone. A moment later, Saiki saw a white Nemean lion in front of him, which was the gatekeeper of this tower. The fairy also informed the young man that he was currently at the 70th level of his abilities. The optimal level to defeat this creature was 320, which was a big difference from what he had. The fairy was worried and wasn't sure that the guy would be able to defeat it. The guy replied that it was just one A rank monster and he was sure he could defeat it even with his eyes closed, adding that if anything, it was even better for him. During his solo grind, when he was attacked by a horde of monsters, it turned into a real disaster, so if he could defeat it first and get a rare drop, the rest of the raid would be much easier for him. The fairy saw that the monster was no longer hesitating and went on the offensive, and she hurried to inform the guy about it. The guy had already seen everything himself, but he was hoping they would fight at close range. He had used his precious skill points to unlock this particular skill. Saiki was completely ready for this battle and hoped for a quick victory, so he used Tenma. Tenma was a spell that caused a significant jump in physical abilities, and while it was active, he was covered in highly concentrated mana. This spell gave quite a big advantage, but its cost was comparably high, so it should be used very carefully. Thanks to a forbidden restriction, the guy could use it for 0 ohm. Saeki knew that thanks to some of his special abilities, he could use this spell without restrictions. The guy also realized that despite his current characteristics, he could fight on equal terms with any A-rank opponent. Saeki, however, still thought that he should not overexert his body by continuously using magic, because he did not want to repeat the same mistake he made in the battle with Naga. The guy thus unlocked a special quest, but he didn't understand what it meant. The fairy hinted at it by pointing to the system window, which said that special quests were his chance for rapid growth. Saeki was very grateful for this. He read that this special quest was a summoning of magic and familiars, and its goal was to make the white Nemean lion surrender and tame it, and the reward for this was the magic of summoning a familiar. The guy realized that this was a little different from the summoning magic he already knew. Saeki also noticed that a familiar could significantly increase his combat potential. The guy realized that his main task was to try to subdue this Nemean lion. Saeki knew that all this had to be done without destroying the lion itself. The guy guessed that he would probably need to change his strategy a little to do this. Saeki tried to get closer to the creature to touch the lion with his palm. The guy commanded the beast to lie down and simultaneously attacked it. Saeki suddenly noticed something that caught his attention. A moment later, a huge paw rose high into the air, and with it, a large column of smoke. It reminded the guy of wind armor, and he concluded that it would probably not be so easy to damage this creature. The fairy shouted to the guy that now was not the best time to experiment. Saeki assured the fairy that everything was fine and under control, and told her that in order to subdue this beast, he first had to show it how great the difference in their strength was. The fairy reminded the guy that he was fighting an A-rank monster recommended for level 320, and it seemed to her that what the guy was saying was simply impossible to achieve. Saeki replied that this was not entirely true and explained that the beast had quite formidable attacks, but the sequence of their attacks was quite simple. For some reason, the guy began to think that with the help of this beast, he would be able to clear out this secret dungeon. Saeki said that he could do everything to achieve his goal and make this beast his own. The guy looked at the creature and apologized in advance for his future actions. Saeki already knew the sequence of this beast's attacks and was going to put his plan into action. A few minutes later, the beast's eyes lit up as it tried to attack the guy, and it looked terrifying. The guy stood unshakable and decided to remind the beast that he already knew all its tricks. Before attacking the beast, Saeki told it that the time had come for its punishment. Saeki repeated to the beast over and over again that it should finally bow down before him. The guy launched another attack, and this time there was a bright flash and something like a thunderbolt. The fairy watched and couldn't believe it because, to be honest, she herself didn't really believe in it anymore. She saw that the guy had really managed to defeat the A-rank monster of this secret dungeon. The guy warned the beast that this time it would be better for it to obey him, and immediately gave the command to lie down. The fairy saw an amazing sight where the big lion bowed its head and lay down in front of the guy. She couldn't believe that the beast had obeyed him so easily, and it was incredible. The guy saw in the system window that as a result of this battle, he was able to unlock a special quest. Saeki was able to obtain summoning magic and a familiar, which was a white Nemean lion. His level was raised, and he received white lion gloves as a reward. The guy was glad that after he subdued the monster, he was able to gain experience and loot, but he decided for himself that he would still equip new weapons. The fairy said that it was all logical because Saeki was able to turn his secret rival in the dungeon into his familiar. The guy completed a special quest that was much more difficult than a normal victory over a monster, and even managed to gain additional experience points. Saeki said that the fairy was absolutely right, and he himself was convinced of her words when he saw that he had gained 50 levels. The fairy advised the guy to distribute his skill points before entering the tower. The guy realized that the sphere was most likely aware of what was on each floor of the tower. Saeki told the fairy that he was counting on her help because he thought he couldn't do it without her. The fairy said that this would not work, and that she did not like this wording very much. She asked, or to be more precise, she demanded that the guy ask her properly. The guy didn't argue and immediately addressed her as the sweetest sphere, who was all-powerful and all-knowing, and said that he was begging her to help him get through the tower. Sphere was satisfied with this wording, so she informed the guy that crowds of undead V-rank monsters roamed the first floor of the dungeon. She also said that their numbers and combined power would make the secret dungeon of rank C look like a walk in the park starting from the second floor and above. Saeki thanked her for this information and chose the spell he thought would be most useful at this stage. The fairy thought that the last spell was too complicated and told the guy about it. Sphere said that she did not think the spell was worth 10 and did not recommend taking it at all. Saeki told Sphere that all the spells he had unlocked were simply irreplaceable, and he was confident that he could turn all his opponents on the first floor into experience points for further clearing of the next floors. The fairy didn't see it that way and now thought that maybe the guy was right in his decisions. Saeki asked the fairy to just trust him and advised her to make herself comfortable and relax. The guy approached the tower and, gathering his courage, said that there was no time to delay and he was ready to move forward. The fairy suddenly remembered that she had forgotten to tell the guy something very important that he absolutely needed to know. She said that once he entered the dungeon, he would not be able to leave until he reached the very core of the dungeon on the upper floors. The fairy wanted to know if Saeki had changed his mind after hearing all this. The boy replied that he was ready to go all the way, and the fairy expected to hear such an answer and believed that Saeki was not really afraid for himself. Saeki said that this was not entirely true and that he was simply much more afraid of losing his younger sister. The fairy understood why Saeki was so eager to enter the dungeon, even though he was not yet ready for this battle. The boy saw that after they entered the door, it immediately closed behind them, and seals appeared on it, indicating that they would not be able to leave just like that. The fairy asked the boy to be very careful and warned him that the undead were already coming straight for them. The guy replied that he was ready, but suddenly said that before the battle began, he decided to use his new spell. Saeki did not think twice and immediately decided to use the concealment spell, which he was sure would soon come in handy. After hiding his presence, it was time to summon the white Nemean lion. Saeki ordered the beast to run across the floor so that all the undead would target him. The creature, which was completely obedient to the guy, hurried to carry out his instructions and attract all the attention of the undead to itself. The guy knew that the undead were quite powerful monsters on their own, but since they had already been destroyed, they lacked any intelligence. If the undead chose a target, they would pursue it to the very end, until they achieved their goal. The guy turned to the creature and told it to run to the center and stay there until he came to it. The lion was loyal and obedient and ready to carry out any command the guy gave him. Psyche decided that the best solution would be to cast a petrification spell on the lion, and knew that it would definitely help. He stood and watched as the lion ran off to carry out the order, and the fairy said that petrification was a rather difficult spell to use, especially considering that it cost a whole 10 skill points. The fairy added that she had previously thought that the price-quality ratio was not equal, but now she was beginning to have doubts. Psyche said that she simply did not expect him to use it on an ally in order to create an unbreakable decoy. The guy said that now that all the undead were gathered in one place, he only needed to cast Tenmu on his sword, and his sword was demonic. He said that after that it was time for holy enchantment, and it had to be done as soon as possible. The fairy realized that by adding holy enchantment to the demonic sword, the guy would be able to use holy magic. Psyche hurried to put his plan into action and hoped that everything would work out. The magic that the boy used achieved its goal, and the undead were driven into the trap created for them. Psyche was very happy with what he saw before him, and it meant one thing: the extermination was complete. The young man joyfully embraced his new friend and praised the lion for a job well done. Psyche's level was raised, and the fairy was convinced that the guy had actually managed to deal with the undead in just a few minutes. The boy told Sphere that she was wrong not to believe in him, but the fairy replied that she did believe in him, but was still surprised after seeing everything with her own eyes. Psyche read in the system window that his level had doubled after this battle, and on top of that, he had also dropped a lot of different items of fairly high rank, which was an incredible result. The guy asked Sphere if all this would be enough for him to earn 500 million yen, and she rushed to check it out right away. The fairy said that if he sold all these things, they would be worth about 600 million yen. Psyche did not expect to hear this, and since the required amount had been reached, he decided that they were done and could return home. The Sphere reminded the guy that she had already told him that he would not be able to leave the tower until he defeated the monsters on each floor and reached the top floor. The guy heard about the top floor and thought about something, trying to figure out how to proceed. Psyche asked the fairy to look somewhere and pointed to the upper floors of the underground tower. The fairy looked where the guy was pointing and saw nothing but the usual ceiling. She asked him not to speak in riddles and rebusses, but to get to the point and explain more clearly. Psyche said that he meant that above them was indeed a normal ceiling with no seals like those on the walls and doors. The fairy finally understood what the guy meant and was sure that he could do it, but she didn't think it was worth doing. She considered it a waste of the secret A-rank dungeon and asked the guy to just be patient. Psyche thought differently because now that he had gathered enough money to save Kotoha, he no longer needed this place. The guy simply asked the fairy to tell him everything she knew about the boss on the top floor. She began to say that the boss of the top floor was a Grim Reaper and that he controlled all the undead that lived in this tower. The recommended level for this was 550. The fairy believed that the guy, in his current state, would not be able to defeat him, and she wanted to say so, but she also understood perfectly well that common sense did not apply to Seiki. Sphere decided not to stop the boy and told him that they should hurry up and save his younger sister, Koto. Psyche was very grateful to her for her help and understanding, and for not trying to dissuade him from this crazy idea. The guy thought that if the boss was a Grim Reaper, he was almost certain that he would use ghost magic. Psyche decided for himself that in that case, he should use this spell. The guy was almost certain that with its help, he would be able to completely suppress him. Psyche decided that there was no point in delaying any longer and was ready to move forward, but first he cast the spell called Tenma. A few minutes later, there was a so-called explosion that rushed upward but spread slightly to the sides. When a certain point was reached, everything around exploded, and the flash of the explosion was very bright. The guy looked at his work and was satisfied because he now had a short path to the upper floor. The fairy asked the guy to be very careful because this was already the boss's arena, and he could attack them at any moment. The guy knew all this and believed that in this battle he could not afford to let his guard down because there was so much at stake. Psyche understood perfectly well that in order to defeat the Grim Reaper in his current state, he had to prevent him from using his techniques. The Grim Reaper could command his undead, and he only had to wave his hand and any command would be carried out. A large number of undead came into combat readiness, so to speak, and followed the young man in a huge crowd. Psyche waited for the most opportune moment and put a perception block on himself. The guy continued to stand in the same place, and all the commotion passed him by as if he were completely invisible. He knew that with the help of ghostly magic, the Grim Reaper was forcing the undead to attack their opponents. Psyche also remembered that if he suddenly used his perception block, they would consider him to be undead as well, which would render the Grim Reaper's magic completely useless. After a while, the Grim Reaper realized that something was wrong and that the undead were not following his orders. He decided to take a closer look to understand what had happened to his undead. Psyche still remembered well how he had fought the Grim Reapers in his past life. That's why the guy knew in advance all the actions that the Grim Reaper was going to take. Psyche decided that it was time to use the first form of the magical Eye of Wisdom. He was glad that he had finally been able to reach the skill tree because, in the past, it had been his forte. The guy knew that the magical Eye of Wisdom was one of the highest ranking magical eyes, but Psyche could only use its first form and was not yet able to unlock its full potential. The first form allowed the guy to see the mana of his opponents. The Dark Priest had no physical body, and since he often disappeared without a trace, it was extremely difficult to hit him. Psyche could now see mana, and this completely changed the picture. He could now determine the location of the Dark Priest and could also hit him. Saiki didn't wait long and immediately took advantage of the situation and rushed to attack his opponent. The Dark Priest was able to dodge the attack, but he didn't like it, and his gaze became more menacing. Saiki was already in full combat readiness, gripping his sword tightly in his hands. A magical sphere was launched, which was not as harmless as it seemed at first glance. Saiki gathered his strength and launched another attack on the Dark Priest, hoping that his weapon would reach its target. The Dark Priest was unable to dodge in time, for which he ultimately had to pay. Saiki saw that he had managed to hit the priest, but he was almost certain that this attack had not caused him any significant damage, and that was because there was too great a difference in their abilities. The boy decided that he had no choice but to attack him again and again until he was finally defeated. Saiki thought that even considering his modest status, he would still be able to resist the priest's attacks using the first form of the magical Eye of Wisdom. However, the young man neglected to consider something very important: the significant difference between his past and his present. Saiki was referring to his emotional vulnerability, which he did not have in his past life. A moment later, the guy just froze, and his gaze became glassy and focused on nothing. Before his eyes, an image of his younger sister, Kotoha, who was not feeling well and was calling for her brother, immediately appeared. Saiki fell to his knees and tried to reach his sister, while the Grim Reaper decided to seize the moment and attack the guy. The boy barely managed to hold on as the priest's attack had achieved its goal when he was completely unprepared for it. The Grim Reaper was pleased with his work and now sat imposingly on his so-called throne. The creature even smiled, baring its large teeth, but the smile looked very creepy. Saiki guessed that it was illusory magic, which was not very good news, and he also realized that he would not be able to dodge the monster's attacks in this state. The guy tried to figure out what to do next. He remembered moments from their shared past when Kotoha told him that she had learned to waltz in a minute. The girl thought it was amazing and really wanted to show it to her brother. Saiki couldn't take his eyes off Kotoha and was very proud of her abilities and new skills. Kotoha was delighted to play the waltz she had learned and hoped that Saiki would like it. After listening to the whole thing, Saiki said it was the best he had ever heard and praised the girl. Kotoha lay on her hospital bed and realized that her life was flashing before her eyes, and she realized that they had been truly happy back then. She remembered how she had learned to play the piano better and better, and her brother had praised her a lot for it. Kotoha began to realize that, apparently, her body had really given up, and this made her very sad. She could no longer fight, but she didn't want to go to the other world either because she loved her older brother so much. Saiki could watch and feel everything, but physically he was still in the secret dungeon. The guy suddenly saw a system notification in front of him, asking if he wanted to remove the forbidden restriction. Saiki couldn't understand what it was. The fairy said she didn't know anything about it either and suggested that maybe it had always been there. The boy couldn't believe that if he agreed, his restriction would be lifted. The priest wanted to attack the guy while he was weak, and Saiki didn't understand anything at that moment, but said that in order not to lose Koto, he was ready to do anything. A few moments later, the forbidden restriction was finally lifted. The guy immediately decided to release the forbidden archmage, and everything around him sparkled with incredible power. He immediately gathered all his power and began to attack, and from the outside it looked very impressive, and the gloomy priest was unable to dodge this attack. As a result, the gloomy priest lay on the ground, trying to come to his senses. The guy looked very composed, and all that was left for him to do was what he had come here for in the first place. He was able to get the very crystal that was supposed to help his sister cope with her illness. Saiki told the priest that he wanted to return to Kotoha as soon as possible, and was going to destroy this dungeon just so that his plan could be carried out. The gloomy priest could only see that an attack was directed at him, one that he would definitely not survive, and that meant his complete defeat. Something was happening in the hospital ward, and unfortunately, it did not bode well. At that moment, the guy flew out of the window at full speed and rushed to where he was so badly needed. He landed easily after jumping and hoped that it would all be worth it. Saiki ran as fast as he could, constantly thinking and praying that he would arrive in time. Kotoha was in a very serious condition at that time, and many doctors and nurses gathered around her, trying in every way to help the girl. The nurse asked Kotoha to hang on and said she had already called her brother, while the doctor shouted into the phone for Saiki-san to come as soon as possible. The guy ran as fast as he could and never stopped believing in his sister Kotoha, that she would be strong enough to pull through. A bright flash that resembled an arrow could be seen among the streets of the city, and it was all thanks to Saiki. The doctors leaned over the girl's hospital bed and looked very sad. One of the nurses held Kotohu's hand tightly and never stopped hoping for the best. The doctor said that the girl's condition was deteriorating very quickly and, apologizing to her, said that they would at least let her go in peace. A few minutes later, the door to the ward burst open as a man rushed in. Saiki had finally made it to his sister and was happier than ever. The doctor turned to the young man and said that he was very sorry, but Kotoha was already unconscious. Nevertheless, he asked Saiki to stay with the girl until the very end. Saiki breathed a sigh of relief and said he was very glad he had managed to get there in time. The doctor didn't quite agree, but then thought about it and said that the boy was right because he could still feel the girl's warmth. The boy approached the nurse and tried to lift her up so that it would be easier for him to do what he wanted. Saiki, without any hesitation or doubt, removed the mask from the girl, and the doctor began to get upset because he didn't understand what the guy was doing. The guy leaned over his sister and brought the magic sphere as close to her as possible. Saiki did everything he needed to do, and now all he could do was wait and hope for a miracle. After what seemed like an eternity, Koto was finally able to open her eyes, and it was an incredible moment of happiness. The doctor and nurses who had been standing behind all this time couldn't believe their eyes and tried to understand what was happening. Kotoha had already regained consciousness, and the first thing she did was call for her father. Saiki could no longer hold back his emotions and gave way to tears, but they were tears of joy and happiness. He rushed to hug his younger sister Kotoha and was very grateful to her for waiting for him. After a while, the doctor informed the young man that his sister was now in perfect health and had no more problems, and also said that Kotoha's wounds had all disappeared. He thought that it was safe to say that there would be no recurrence. Saiki replied that he was very happy to hear all this. The doctor also told the young man that they planned to discharge his sister tomorrow, which was the best news for Saiki. He went on to say that based on his current understanding of medicine, he still couldn't believe that the girl had been cured of an incurable disease after taking only one dose of the medicine, and the doctor considered it to be some kind of miracle. The doctor decided to ask Saiki what he had given his sister. The young man replied that it was a magical drug called an elixir, and told him that he had found it in the dungeon. Saiki also said that there were rumors that this elixir could cure anything, so he decided to take a chance on it. The doctor said that he knew that something like this was in the dungeon. The doctor also told the guy that such places were indeed extremely mysterious. Saiki was slightly surprised by the doctor's knowledge. The next day, as promised, the doctor discharged Saiki's sister, and the kids were finally able to leave the hospital. The girl stretched with such pleasure and said to her brother with a smile on her face that the fresh autumn air outside was energizing. Saiki was overjoyed that Kotoha seemed to be feeling fine, and there was no trace of illness on her face. Kotoha also decided to share with her brother that it seemed to her that all the pain she had felt was not real, and that it was as if it had not happened to her at all. Saiki was happy to hear this, and suddenly his attention was drawn to a taxi standing right next to them. Kotoha guessed her brother's intentions and asked him not to do so, telling him that since she had just recovered, she would like to walk home. Saiki was surprised because their house was quite far away, and it would take them a long time to walk there, and since Kotoha had just recovered, he wasn't sure it was a good idea. Kotoha replied to her brother that she was fine and had everything under control, and if anything happened, he could just carry her on his back. The boy realized that he would most likely not be able to dissuade and convince his younger sister. Saiki didn't want to spoil the girl's mood, so he agreed to her request to walk home, and Kotoha was very happy. The boy asked the girl what she would like for dinner today and said that since they were celebrating her discharge today, she could choose sushi or barbecue or anything else she wanted. Kotoha thought about this question very carefully. It took the girl only a moment to think, and she replied to Saiki that she would really like his signature curry for dinner today. The guy decided to tell the girl that if it was a matter of money, she shouldn't worry about anything and could choose whatever she wanted. Kotoha replied that it wasn't about money at all and explained that what she wanted most was to eat food that he had cooked himself, and that his curry was always very tasty. Saiki didn't mind, but warned that in that case they would have to stop by the supermarket on the way. Kotoha looked very happy and asked her brother to buy her some pudding, and he replied that he would buy as much as she wanted. A short time after the kids entered the store, they finally crossed the threshold of their home, and the girl was so happy because she hadn't been there in so long. Kotoha saw that the light was on behind the bathroom door and decided to check what was going on. Saiki didn't immediately realize that Sphere was most likely behind that door, but he hurried to prevent his sister from seeing her. Sphere was taking a bath, eating lots of different delicacies, namely French fries, and looked very happy and relaxed. Without opening her eyes, Sphere said that the fast food of this world was simply wonderful for her, and that she was already becoming addicted to it. Kotoha stood frozen in one place and couldn't believe that she was really seeing a fairy in front of her, and the girl said the last sentence out loud. The fairy opened her eyes as she did not expect that she was no longer alone in this room, and that guests had come to visit her. Sphere looked at the girl and guessed that this was probably Kotoha, who had just recovered and been discharged from the hospital. Kotoha did not understand how the fairy knew anything about her, so the fairy asked the girl not to call her that anymore and told Kotoha that her name was Sphere and that she had helped her older brother. Sphere added that the girl couldn't even imagine how many times she had saved Saiki. Sphere told the girl that her older brother was willing to do anything to help her. Kotoha thanked Sphere from the bottom of her heart, both for herself and for the fact that the fairy had not abandoned her brother in his hour of need. The boy saw the fairy smile and say that, unlike Saeki, she was a well-behaved child. He realized that for some reason, they seemed to get along quite well. Saiki decided that he couldn't waste any more time and went to sort out the ingredients and start cooking the curry. After a while, the kids sat down at the table and wished each other bon appetit. Kotoha ate only one spoonful, but her whole range of emotions was already reflected on her face, because the girl found it very tasty. The girl told her brother that she was very happy to finally be able to eat his signature curry for the first time in a long time. Saiki said that her words made him realize that all his efforts had paid off and were not in vain. Kotoha tried to convey all her feelings and sensations to her brother and said that she felt alive again. The fairy thought that this was quite logical because the girl had practically gone to the other world, and it was not surprising that Kotoha now felt this way. The guy thought that Sphere had no right to say such things to the girl, but since Kotoha seemed to laugh at these words, the guy didn't dwell on it. All of the guy's attention was suddenly drawn to the TV in their room, which was showing the news reporting on some urgent announcement. The kids heard the news report say that a huge dungeon had appeared in the Tokyo subway area, and that the Adventurers Guild had already declared it an A-rank dungeon. The guild was currently calling on clans to clear it out. Upon hearing the news, Kotoha realized that for some reason, more and more dungeons had been appearing lately. Saiki, on the other hand, was thinking about how this A-rank dungeon was huge, and judging by all appearances, it would take quite a long time to clear it. The guy suddenly received a notification in the system window stating that he had been given an urgent quest as compensation for removing his restriction. The task was to clear the Crystal Mines dungeon within a certain time frame. The fairy said that there should be no time-limited quests, but what was more important was that this was compensation for removing the forbidden restriction, and it was a special skill that would make the guy stronger. The guy figured that since it was a reward, then it would be compensation, and he didn't really have a choice. Kotoha sat at the table and didn't quite understand what was going on, but her face already showed concern for her brother. The guy guessed that Kotoha couldn't see anything, so he apologized to the girl if he had said something strange. Saiki repeated to his sister that everything was fine and asked her to continue eating and not to worry about anything. After a delicious dinner and such an eventful evening, Kotoha was already asleep in her bed, feeling completely safe. The guy, however, couldn't sleep at that time and kept thinking about the latest news, and it was very strange that even the Great Sphere didn't know what was going on. The Sphere saw that the report was still going on, saying that the guy had 29 days left. The fairy still thought that since the quest mentioned compensation, it was highly likely that it had to do with his transformation in the battle with the Dark Priest. The fairy said that she didn't know anything else. The guy thought this was very strange because the fairy was in charge of the forbidden restriction, and she should be aware of what was happening. The sphere said that this was actually the first time she had heard about the forbidden release, and she thought that only he could know what was going on. Saiki replied that it was certainly unfortunate to hear, but then suddenly said that he had one guess. Sphere was surprised that the guy had any ideas about it, since she herself was actually unaware of it. Saiki was almost certain that it had to do with his transformation into his former self, and if you considered it a spell, the conclusion seemed obvious. He believed that in reality, the removal of the restriction was most likely a protective function of the forbidden restriction, and he also thought that it should have worked when his life was in danger. He also said that for the spell to work, he needed an equivalent amount of energy. However, during the battle with the Dark Priest, after he removed the restriction, he did not need to pay any compensation. The fairy said that based on the fundamentals of magic, this was simply impossible, and that she couldn't say what it meant. The guy replied that it all meant that in exchange for being saved in the battle with the Dark Priest, he had to pay compensation under any circumstances, as it was a kind of deferred payment. The fairy now began to understand something, and it became clear to her why this quest was called compensation. Saiki said that she was thinking in the right direction, but there were still many things that he did not understand. The sphere suddenly noticed that Saiki had called it a deferred payment. The guy said that she was right in guessing that if he didn't complete the urgent quest in the allotted time, he would most likely go to the other world. The fairy believed that in that case, they should hurry up and clear all the crystal mines. She also said that it would most likely be the very dungeon they had seen on TV, since the quest had appeared at that very moment. The guy agreed, and even though he didn't like it, it seemed that his adventures as an adventurer would continue. The next day, Kotoha got ready and, in a good mood, said goodbye to her brother and went about her business. Saiki said goodbye to her and couldn't take his eyes off his younger sister, very happy that she had recovered. Kotoha left the house, her positive energy bubbling over because she wanted to live life to the fullest and not miss even the smallest moments. Saiki watched all this from the balcony, and after making sure that his sister was all right, he decided that it was time for him to go about his business. After a while, the female consultants informed him that he currently had an F rank, and they decided to clarify whether he really wanted to take the exam to upgrade to an A rank. Saiki replied with a very serious expression on his face that he really wanted to. The girls moved away from him and discussed how from time to time, incompetent people like him came to them and asked to take an exam that was unsuitable for them in order to advance. They believed that the guy just wanted to prove himself. He heard all this, but he was thinking about the crystal mines, which were a huge A-rank dungeon that had suddenly appeared in the Tokyo metropolitan area. Because it was under the control of the guild, the dungeon was ordinary and not secret. In order to clear this dungeon, he would have to join a clan of at least B rank, but to do that, he would first need to raise his own rank. He had only been in secret dungeons, so his rank reflected an obvious lack of achievements. The guy had no choice but to raise his rank at once by taking a promotion exam. To pass the exam for rank A, he would have to measure his characteristics and also pass a practical exam. The guy first had to touch the measuring crystal, which Saiki did. The girl couldn't believe it when she saw that she was facing an incompetent level 240 and thought it was a mistake. Saiki asked the girl if there were any problems, but she replied that there were none, and said that the guy had passed the measurement of characteristics. She informed him that there would be a practical exam next, and that they would contact him and call him, so the guy went on with his business. Saiki suddenly heard a strange conversation in which a man told his interlocutor that he was not at all surprised that he had been expelled. The boy told the man that he was not the only one responsible for their failure to clear the dungeon. The man's name was Ryuzaki, and he was an A-rank adventurer. He replied to the boy that they failed precisely because the boy's skill was useless. Ryuzaki believed that the boy should thank him for holding out for so long. The boy said that he could easily accept the fact that he would only get a small part of the loot, but he would never take the blame for the failure of the entire clan. Ryuzaki was convinced that they had failed to clear the dungeon solely because of his short-sightedness. The boy believed that the man was simply trying to shift the blame, but in his opinion, that was not right. Ryuzaki became very angry with the boy and already swung for his attack, looking menacing. His hand did not reach its target because Saiki intervened and stood between him and the boy. Ryuzaki did not know this man and did not understand why the guy had interfered in their conversation and dared to intervene. Saiki replied to the man's question that he was just an adventurer who happened to be passing by at that moment. Ryuza said that outsiders shouldn't interfere in other people's business, and the guy replied that he wasn't going to until it came to blows. Suddenly, it was announced that the A-rank adventurer Ryuza was requested to come to the reception desk. The man said that he was being called so the guys could consider themselves lucky, and he would pretend that nothing had happened. After walking away from the guys, Ryuzaki turned around and said that was all for now, but he would definitely deal with them later. The boy apologized to Saiki for having to intervene in their conflict. The guy said not to worry about it and that he heard them talking about shifting the blame. Saiki wanted to know what had happened between them, and the boy replied that it might seem like he was just complaining, so he asked if the guy really wanted to hear his side of the story. The boy said that Ryuzaki was the leader of the Red Dragons clan, of which he was a member. He also said that it was an excellent clan with high morals. They all wanted to clear a high-level dungeon with a group of 10 people, but on their way in, they stumbled upon a trap that killed everyone except Ryuzaki and himself. He believed that Ryuzaki was to blame since he was their leader. The boy added that, as a support member, he had a fairly low position in their clan. The boy told the guy that this was why Ryuzaki tried to blame him for everything that happened. Saiki listened very carefully to the boy and replied that it all sounded terrible, of course. The guy suddenly heard an announcement that Saiki-sama was being asked to come to the first arena because his exam for promotion to rank A was ready. Saiki told the boy that it was time for him to go. The boy assumed that since the practical exam consisted of a demonstration sparring match against an A-rank adventurer, Ryuzaki must have been called to the reception desk precisely to act as the examiner. He was almost certain that Ryuzaki would be his opponent, and in his opinion, that wasn't the best news. The boy warned Saiki and said that the man was very dangerous, and that every time he acted as an examiner, his opponent suffered terrible injuries, so he thought it would be better for the guy to refuse. Saiki replied that there was no need to worry so much, and added that, although you couldn't really tell by looking at him, he was actually quite strong. The boy looked at the guy and still stuck to his opinion, believing that it was better to refuse, otherwise everything could end very badly. After a while, Ryuzaki stood in the arena right in front of Saiki, and the man couldn't help but laugh because he thought it was a wonderful coincidence. Ryuzaki couldn't even imagine that the incompetent person he had been told about would be this guy. The man immediately warned the guy that he shouldn't even hope to get out of there unscathed. Ryuzaki said in all seriousness that he would make sure the guy would never be able to work as an adventurer again. Saiki replied that he was also very glad that his opponent was him, and these words slightly surprised the man. The guy explained that in that case, he wouldn't have to hold back with such an unworthy person. The man didn't like these words and decided that he would definitely give the guy what he deserved. It was announced to the guys that the practical exam had begun, and the man immediately decided to attack the guy, confident that one strike would be enough to show who was boss. The young man struggled but managed to jump aside and thus avoided the attack. Saiki saw that the man had split the ground with his bare fist, and noticed that he had quite high characteristics for a person of rank A. Ryuzaki shouted to the guy that he wouldn't be able to run away from him for long, so he decided to use gravity. Saiki saw that he was being pulled into it and struggled, but it became more and more difficult with each attempt. Ryuzaki shouted that it was the end for the guy and prepared to finish what he had started. The man's hand was already flying towards the guy, but he managed to dodge it in an instant and survived. Saiki maneuvered and, pushing off with his hand, was able to jump over the man completely. Ryuzaki did not expect such actions from the guy and thought that it was most likely an accident. The man told the boy that he had done the right thing by dodging. Saiki decided to ask the man if he was right in thinking that it was a gravity-controlling ability, and the guy said that he thought it suited the man's physique well. Ryuzaki said that Saiki was too witty, and that if he weren't so cocky, the man would even take him into his clan. The man said ironically that it was a pity that the guy's career as an adventurer would come to an end today. Saiki looked at the man and noticed a large amount of mana, which was to be expected from an A-rank adventurer. The guy didn't want to wait any longer, so he decided it was time to use Genma on him. The man was very surprised by the young man's abilities, and now he certainly couldn't call him weak. But Saiki was a problem for his clan. Ryuzaki told the guy that it was good that he could stop him right here and not return to this issue anymore. Saiki took a fighting stance and said that the man's luck would not last long and might not be enough for long. Ryuzaki was ready for new attacks and believed that the guy would not be able to hold out for long. The man headed towards the guy and decided to use a gravity prison. Saiki suddenly felt that his body had become much heavier, which slightly complicated his actions. The guy noticed that Ryuzaki was very good at using his skills, and his hand-to-hand combat skills were also excellent. Saiki realized that he had slightly underestimated the A rank, and therefore decided that the best option for him would be to use the Eye of Wisdom to try to block Ryuzaki. At that moment, Ryuzaki used his power and tried to pull the guy towards him using magic. Saiki remained standing in his place, and it appeared that the man's plan had failed. Ryuzaki realized that the young man had managed to destroy his gravitational force, which he had not expected. The man was finally convinced that he was facing a worthy opponent, and was ready to fight until one of them was sent to the other world. A few minutes later, the man was left alone in the arena, and an announcement was made over the loudspeaker that Saiki's practical exam was over. Ryuzaki caught up with the young man and shouted at him to stop immediately, as their fight was not over yet. Saiki replied that he had heard the dictator tell them all that his exam was over and that they were finished. The man was very angry and said that he didn't care who said what, and that he wanted to finish their personal battle. The guy said that his goal was to become an A-rank adventurer, and that he only cared about passing the practical exam. Saiki left anyway, and the man became even angrier and shouted that he was giving the guy exactly 1 day. Ryuzaki decided for himself that he would make sure they could finish their fight. After a while, Saiki received his new card and was very happy about it. The guy thanked the girl at the reception desk, and at that moment, a boy he already knew approached him and asked if everything had gone well. Saiki replied that everything had gone well and added that he was lucky that his practical exam was quite short. The boy was glad that everything had gone well for the guy because he was worried, as he had seen many adventurers suffer during this time. He also said that he didn't see any injuries on the guy and therefore assumed that Saiki probably had some kind of skills. Saiki replied that he was apparently strong enough to be recognized as an A-rank adventurer. The boy said that everyone knew Ryuzaki was quite stubborn, so there was a good chance he might come to the guy's place in the next few days, and so he asked Saiki to contact him if any problems arose. He added that he could of course be expelled from the clan, but he still thought he could be very useful. Saiki kept in touch and thanked him. Saiki was now an A-rank adventurer, but he still didn't know how to join the clan. The guy thought he could try asking his acquaintances Suzukaizi and Takai. Saiki froze as he was suddenly overcome by very strange feelings and tried to understand what they were. The guy felt that a monster was somewhere nearby and heard the cries of people running away. The loudspeakers on all the streets announced important news that the monster had escaped and that everyone needed to evacuate immediately. The announcer asked all nearby adventurers to provide emergency assistance. Saiki thought for a moment and already had a plan for his next steps. The guy knew he would feel guilty if he ignored these people who would most likely be destroyed. Saiki didn't hesitate and, using magic, ran as fast as he could, then decided to use the Eye of Wisdom. The guy was standing on the roof of one of the city's houses looking around when he suddenly noticed a bright flash on one of the streets and guessed that this was the epicenter of the events. The creature that had managed to escape resembled a snake, and it was this monster that posed a threat to all people. Saiki decided that he needed to deal with this as soon as possible in order to avoid disaster. Some time ago in the exam control room, a man watched the guy's results and couldn't believe what he saw. He remembered that not long ago this guy was very weak, but somehow he managed to gain A-rank strength in such a short period of time. The man no longer really believed that Siki Iori was truly incompetent and unskilled, because it was clear that the guy had clearly gone far beyond the limits of one. The man decided that, for starters, he simply needed to report this to the guild's senior leadership. Some adventurers who were the first to arrive at the scene were already fighting the monster. This task proved to be difficult, and the creature had not yet been defeated, but no one was going to give up. One of the men came to his colleague's aid, and it was very timely because the guy was already in serious trouble. The monster was rampaging and had no intention of falling into the hands of these adventurers, destroying everything around it in the process. One of the guys used a wind cannon and aimed it directly at the creature. The guy arrived at the scene and used the wind gun, saying that since he was the leader, he thought the boss should be left to him, and the rest of the guys should just focus on the weaker monsters. The man knew that this guy's name was Saito, and he never liked him, but Saito was the strongest, so he told his friend that they'd better do as he said. Saito went one-on-one with the monster and warned the monster, which reminded him of an oversized snake, that it didn't stand a chance against him. Each of these guys was busy destroying monsters that had somehow managed to escape. Saiki watched all this from the roof of a house and didn't know whether he should intervene. The guy didn't know what to do because he thought that if he intervened, he could be accused of stealing the guy's loot, and that would just waste even more time. Saiki therefore decided to just watch for now and see how strong the guys were. Saiki watched the guy and guessed that he was probably an A rank, and he also heard the same guy confidently shouting that if he was here, everything would be over quickly with the boss. The guy thought that if he defeated this adventurer, he would most likely be promoted to rank A and would not have to take the exam, as he would simply be promoted for his achievements. He believed that being an adventurer was not so difficult, but rather the opposite, and it brought him joy. Saiki, still on the roof, noticed that the guy was still talking, even though it was completely inappropriate at that moment. The guy, apparently because of this, did not notice that the boss was gaining strength, and Saiki understood that in this case, nothing good would come of it. Saito finally noticed the danger that threatened him, but unfortunately, he did so too late. The monster began to attack, and everything in its path was instantly destroyed. Saiki, watching all this, realized that he would probably have to intervene after all, since the guy really didn't want to think for himself. Saito saw that the monster was very close to him, and that it wanted to attack him, but suddenly he was interrupted by a man who unexpectedly appeared and stood between them. Saiki looked very focused, and Saito looked surprised, realizing that this guy had just saved him. Without wasting any more time, Saiki rushed into the attack and was going to deal with everyone who wanted to harm people. Some people watched this from the sidelines, standing on the roof, and they were surprised at what the guy was able to do with just one attack. Sajiki, standing below and looking at these people, thought that from their perspective, it looked as if he had stolen their prey, and that perhaps the best solution was to just leave. The men stood and looked at this mysterious guy, trying to understand what was going on with this adventurer. Saiki was already leaving the battlefield, and the men couldn't help but notice that the guy was on a whole other level. Someone managed to film the guy while he was using his magic during the battle with the monsters, and these photos spread across the internet. The girl got some beautiful shots and now sat admiring the beautiful fencing, looking at her phone and wondering if this man could be stronger than her. She couldn't help but notice that this guy was quite handsome and considered herself very lucky to have been able to take these valuable pictures. The girl thought that if he was an adventurer, he was at least a B rank. The girl just found it strange that she had never seen him anywhere before. She assumed that maybe this guy didn't have a clan yet, and hoped that she would be able to find him in the database. After a while, the girl actually managed to find this guy in the database, and was surprised that he turned out to be incompetent, despite being so strong. She was intrigued and thought that all this could turn out to be very interesting and entertaining. Saiki, already at home, told his sister that using the phone while eating was bad manners, and asked her to forget about it right away. Kotoha asked him to just look at what she had found, and then Saiki would immediately understand why she was so absorbed in her phone. Saiki didn't immediately understand what she was talking about, and only after he saw the photo captioned, "Super Strong Adventurer Destroys Monster in an Instant," did he realize that it was a photo of himself. There were already many comments under this photo. Looking at all this, the guy didn't understand what was going on in the world with these people.